1 month ago, my wife drove to Knoxville to help our son and his wife settle into their new home. When I arrived to check on her, the old man across the street walked straight toward my truck and said, "You need to call an ambulance right now before you go in that house." My name is Joseph, and I am 69 years old. I spent 40 years running a heavy machinery repair business in Atlanta. I thought I knew how to fix broken things. I thought I understood how the world worked. I was entirely wrong. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your loved ones from the selfish people they trusted most. I know the sound of a failing engine. I know the smell of burning oil. When I stepped out of my truck in Knoxville that afternoon, I immediately smelled rot. It was a sharp metallic stench hanging heavy in the humid Tennessee air. I looked at my son Aaron's perfectly manicured lawn. The grass was freshly cut, but the front windows were tightly shut. The blinds were drawn. Mr. Gallagher stood at the edge of the property line. I did not know the man, but his posture screamed urgency. He gripped his wooden cane, his knuckles white, and pointed directly at the second-story window. "I saw her collapse in the kitchen 2 days ago," Mr. Gallagher stated. His voice was tight, scraping against his throat. "Your son closed the blinds immediately after. No one has left the house since. Call the paramedics." I did not ask questions. 40 years in a repair shop taught me to trust the warning signs. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed 911. I gave the dispatcher the exact address and sprinted up the concrete steps. The front door was locked. I did not knock. I did not ring the doorbell to announce my arrival. I raised my heavy work boot and kicked the deadbolt precisely where the frame met the strike plate. The wood splintered with a loud, violent crack. The heavy door flew open, hitting the interior wall. The stench of stale urine and sickness hit me like a physical blow. The air conditioning was turned off. The house felt like a suffocating oven. I rushed directly into the kitchen. I found my wife Sylvia lying motionless on the cold ceramic tiles. Her skin was a terrifying shade of gray. Her lips were cracked and tinged with blue. I dropped to my knees beside her. Sylvia had managed the accounting books for my company until her retirement last year. Her mind was sharper than a steel blade, and she was always meticulous about her health. I checked her pulse. It was erratic, fluttering weakly against my fingertips like a dying bird. Her breathing was terribly shallow. I frantically scanned the area around her. Her emergency diabetic kit was scattered across the floor. I spotted her prescription insulin pen on the granite counter above her. It lay completely empty. Sylvia never let her insulin run empty. She always kept backup vials in the refrigerator. I opened the refrigerator door. The shelves were fully stocked with expensive organic groceries, but the designated medical drawer was entirely bare. Someone had actively removed her backup supply. I looked back at Sylvia. A cold sweat broke out across my neck. This was not an accident. This was an active, deliberate situation meant to end her life. Heavy footsteps echoed upstairs. A shouting match raged above me, muffled by the ceiling but entirely vicious. I stood up from the kitchen floor and moved silently toward the base of the staircase. I recognized the shrill, panicked voice of Megan, my white daughter-in-law. "I told you to sell the boat," Megan shrieked. "We need $20,000 by Friday or my investors are walking away completely. You are ruining my company." I gripped the wooden banister. Megan had founded a tech startup 3 years ago, funded entirely by Aaron's relentless borrowing. Aaron yelled back, his voice thick with arrogance and desperation. "We do not touch the boat," he snapped. "It is the only asset in my name. The insurance payout takes 30 days to process. We just float your business on credit until the check clears." I froze. The blood roared in my ears. An insurance payout. They were standing directly above the woman who gave Aaron life, calculating how many days it would take to cash a check generated by her death. Megan scoffed loudly. 30 days is too long, she argued. The bank will foreclose on this house before the underwriters even verify the death certificate. Aaron slammed a door upstairs. "The autopsy will be completely clean," he insisted. "Diabetics slip into comas all the time. It is a natural medical event. Just hold your nerve and call the bank to request a 30-day extension." I did not rush up the stairs to strangle my son. I did not scream. I retreated silently to the kitchen and knelt beside my wife again. The rage crystallized inside me, cold and absolute. I needed them to feel completely safe. Sirens wailed in the distance, tearing through the quiet suburban neighborhood. The noise grew louder by the second. The heavy boots of the paramedics pounded up the driveway. They rushed into the kitchen with a stretcher and oxygen equipment. The sudden commotion finally drew Aaron and Megan out of their bedroom. They appeared at the top of the stairs. Aaron froze, his eyes widening in sheer panic. Megan gripped the banister, her knuckles turning bone white. "Dad," Aaron stammered, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here? Mom just caught a bad stomach bug." I completely ignored him. I stepped back and allowed the emergency medical technicians to do their job. I watched them load Sylvia onto the stretcher. I followed them out the door and climbed into my truck, leaving my son and his wife standing in their hallway. An hour later, I stood in the harsh fluorescent light of the emergency room. The hospital smelled of bleach and sterile fear. "Doctor." Eris walked through the swinging double doors. He held a clipboard and wore a grave professional expression. "Mr. Joseph, your wife is in a severe diabetic coma," Dr. Eris explained quietly. "Her blood sugar levels are catastrophic. We managed to stabilize her, but the situation is critical. We tested the residual fluid in the empty insulin pen the paramedics brought in. It was not insulin, it was saline solution." My heart pounded against my ribs like a sledgehammer. Saline solution does not accidentally end up inside a prescription insulin pen. It requires a medical syringe and deliberate malicious intent. Aaron and Megan rushed through the hospital entrance doors just as the doctor finished speaking. Megan began rubbing her dry eyes, preparing to perform a spectacular display of absolute panic. I turned to face them, keeping my expression perfectly blank. The silent adjustment had begun, and I knew exactly how to destroy them. Aaron burst through the double doors of the intensive care waiting area, closely followed by Megan. She wore a perfectly tailored cream blouse that contrasted sharply with her flushed, tear-streaked face. Her performance was immediate and spectacular. She rushed across the linoleum floor and threw her arms around my neck, burying her face into my shoulder. Her sobs echoed loudly enough for every nurse at the station to hear. She was building an alibi in real time. I stood entirely rigid, my hands resting flat against my sides. Aaron hung back, shifting his weight from foot to foot, unable to meet my gaze. Megan pulled away and wiped a manufactured tear from her cheek. She looked at the attending nurse and then at me. "Sylvia has been getting so confused lately," Megan cried, her voice carrying a practiced tremor. "Her dementia has been worsening rapidly over the last few weeks. We tried to monitor her medications, but she gets so combative when we intervene. She must have grabbed the saline flush instead of her insulin pen in her confusion." I stared at the woman who had married my son. Sylvia managed the complex financial ledgers for my heavy machinery business for 35 years. Just last week, she successfully audited an error in our property tax returns. Her mind was a steel trap. She did not have dementia. She did not mix up medications. I recognized the narrative Megan was laying down. She was painting Sylvia as a senile, combative old woman responsible for her own fatal mistake, a tragic medical accident, a convenient narrative for a grieving daughter-in-law. I did not contradict her. I did not shout the truth about the empty medical drawer or the argument I overheard. I maintained absolute silence. My silence unnerved Aaron. He stepped forward and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, projecting the image of a comforting son. "You look exhausted," Dad Aaron said. "The doctors have her stabilized for now. You should go find a hotel and get some rest. We will stay here and handle all the medical decisions." He wanted me out of the hospital. He needed full control over the narrative and the medical staff. I let my shoulders slump. I hunched my back slightly, physically shrinking into the role of a terrified, bewildered old man. I rubbed my temples and let out a long, shaky breath. "You are right, Aaron," I mumbled, forcing my voice to sound frail and uncertain. The drive from Atlanta took everything out of me. My head is spinning from all this medical terminology. I do not understand any of it. Megan exchanged a swift, triumphant look with Aaron. Her posture relaxed instantly. I told them I could not afford a hotel room. I insisted I needed to return to their house just to gather Sylvia's clothes and pack an overnight bag for her. I promised I would stay out of their way. Aaron let out a sharp exhale of relief. He handed me his spare house key without a second thought. "Take your time, Dad," Aaron instructed smoothly. "Rest in the guest room. Mom is safe with us." I took the key. I thanked them for their dedication. I turned and walked out of the sliding hospital doors. The moment the cool evening air hit my face, my frail posture vanished. My back straightened. I gripped the spare key tight enough to cut into my palm. I climbed into my truck and drove back to their neighborhood. I parked my truck 2 blocks away from their house to avoid drawing the attention of any neighbors. I walked the remaining distance in the shadows and used Aaron's spare key to unlock the front door. The house remained dead quiet. The sour smell of the kitchen had faded slightly, but the memory of Sylvia lying on the floor burned fiercely in my mind. I did not go to the guest room. I did not pack a single piece of clothing. I walked directly upstairs and strode into Megan's home office. The room was a shrine to her aggressive ambition. Framed startup magazine articles decorated the walls. Sleek, leather-bound portfolios cluttered the expansive mahogany desk. I ignored the superficial trophies and focused on the heavy filing cabinet tucked beneath the window. The top two drawers contained standard tax documents and utility bills. The bottom drawer was secured with a heavy-duty cylindrical lock. Megan did not lock up client data. She locked up secrets. I returned to my truck and retrieved a steel flathead screwdriver and a heavy rubber mallet from my toolbox. I walked back upstairs, wedged the flathead directly under the lock collar, and struck the handle hard with the mallet. The locking mechanism snapped with a sharp crack. I slid the drawer open. The space was mostly empty, save for a single thick manila folder positioned perfectly in the center. The tab was labeled Contingencies in Megan's sharp, angular handwriting. I pulled the folder out and laid it flat on the mahogany desk. I turned on the desk lamp and opened the cover. The documents inside confirmed every dark suspicion I held since pulling into their driveway. The top document was a comprehensive life insurance policy taken out on Sylvia. The primary death benefit was $500,000. The sole named beneficiary was Aaron. I flipped to the signature page. Sylvia's name was signed at the bottom, but the handwriting was entirely wrong. The loops were jagged and the pressure marks were too heavy. Sylvia had pristine, flowing cursive developed from decades of accounting work. This was a crude forgery. I checked the execution date printed at the bottom corner of the page. The policy had been finalized and bound exactly 32 days ago. They secured the insurance just days before inviting Sylvia to stay with them in Knoxville. The timeline was brutally clear. Megan's tech company hit a financial wall. She demanded capital. Aaron realized his mother's sudden death would trigger a massive, untraceable payout. They lured Sylvia away from Atlanta under the guise of needing help organizing their new home. They isolated her, altered her medication, and planned to collect the profit while playing the role of devastated children. I pulled my phone from my pocket and activated the camera. I systematically photographed every single page of the insurance policy. I captured the forged signature, the policy numbers, and the underwriter contact information. I made sure the lighting was perfectly clear. Once I secured the digital evidence, I placed the documents back into the manila folder. I returned the folder to the exact center of the broken drawer and slid it shut. I pushed the snapped locking mechanism back into place, arranging it so it appeared entirely undisturbed at a casual glance. I wiped the desk surface to remove any smudges. I grabbed a duffel bag, threw a few of Sylvia's blouses inside, and walked out. I drove back to the Knoxville hospital with Sylvia's overnight bag sitting on the passenger seat. The bag was merely a prop, a physical alibi to justify my absence while I secured the evidence of their deadly greed. I walked through the sliding glass doors and navigated the sterile corridors until I reached the intensive care unit. Aaron was sitting in the waiting area, staring blankly at a muted television screen. He looked up when I approached. I did not waste time with pleasantries or false comfort. I dropped the overnight bag onto the nearest vinyl chair. I just finalized the arrangements, I stated, keeping my voice entirely level and devoid of the rage boiling in my veins. I hired a specialized private medical transport service. They will be here at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. They are moving your mother to the Emory University Hospital Neurology Wing down in Atlanta. Aaron stood up slowly. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, ashen hue. Emory meant the best doctors in the Southeast. It meant comprehensive toxicology screens and relentless oversight. It meant Sylvia would survive and their $500,000 payout would evaporate into thin air. "You cannot do that," Aaron stammered, stepping into the hallway to block my path to the ICU double doors. "The doctors here said she needs absolute rest. A transport to Atlanta is too dangerous for her right now. It could trigger another crisis. The doctors here do not know her medical history," I countered smoothly, locking my eyes onto his. "Her primary care physician is in Atlanta. Her entire life is in Atlanta. She belongs in her own city, surrounded by professionals who understand her specific biological needs. I am signing the discharge and transfer authorization forms right now." Aaron did not move. He squared his shoulders and planted his feet firmly on the linoleum floor, physically barring my entry to the intensive care unit. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded legal document. He smoothed the thick paper against his chest and thrust it toward my face. The bold black lettering across the top read, "Durable Medical Power of Attorney." "You are not signing anything, Dad," Aaron said, his voice hardening with a sudden unearned authority. "Mom foresaw this exact situation. She knew you would try to overrule her care. I stared at the paper. It bore a notary stamp and a signature that mimicked Sylvia's handwriting perfectly. "What is this fabrication, Aaron?" I asked, maintaining a calm, unbothered exterior. "It is a legally binding directive," Aaron declared loudly, ensuring the nurses at the nearby station could hear every word. "Mom signed this over to me last Tuesday. She sat at our kitchen table and told Megan and me that she was terrified of your declining judgment. She said you were getting too old, too confused to handle serious medical emergencies. She explicitly entrusted her health decisions solely to me." The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Sylvia had never doubted my judgment for a single second of our 42-year marriage. We built our heavy machinery business together. We survived recessions and betrayals together. She would never hand her life over to a son who could not even balance his own checkbook. Aaron tapped the forged signature with his index finger. "The transport is canceled. I am officially in charge of her medical care. You have zero legal authority to move her, treat her, or discharge her. She stays right here in Knoxville until she passes peacefully." A stern-looking woman wearing a hospital administrator badge marched down the hallway. She had clearly been waiting in the wings for this exact confrontation. Aaron handed her the forged document. She adjusted her glasses, scanning the notary seal and the signature lines with infuriating slowness. I watched her read the death warrant my son had drafted for my wife. "Mr. Joseph," the administrator said, handing the document back to Aaron, "this power of attorney is entirely valid and correctly filed in our system. Under Tennessee state law, your son holds the exclusive right to dictate your wife's medical care. You cannot authorize a transfer. That document is a complete fraud," I stated clearly. "My wife managed corporate ledgers until last year. She would never sign away her medical autonomy without consulting her primary physician or her legal spouse." The administrator's face turned to stone. "We follow the legal paperwork, sir. Your son has instructed us to limit her visitors to reduce her stress. I must ask you to step away from the intensive care unit." I took a deliberate step toward the double doors. I needed to see Sylvia. I needed to assure her I was fighting for her. Aaron raised his hand. The administrator instantly signaled down the corridor. Two burly hospital security guards rounded the corner, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. They flanked Aaron, creating a human wall between me and my dying wife. "Please vacate the floor, sir, or we will have to escort you off the premises," the taller guard warned. I looked at Aaron. A slow, sickening smirk spread across his face. He believed he had won. He believed the law was an impenetrable shield protecting his murder plot. He essentially owned the hospital room. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw a punch or create a scene for the security guards to weaponize against me in a police report. I stared directly into Aaron's eyes and let him enjoy his fleeting victory. Then I turned on my heel and walked away. I strode out of the hospital, the automatic doors sliding shut behind me, sealing my wife inside a hostile environment. I climbed into the cab of my truck, closed the heavy door, and locked it. The silence in the cabin was absolute. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the encrypted messaging application. I attached the high-resolution photographs I had taken in Megan's home office. I selected the image of the $500,000 life insurance policy, highlighting the freshly forged signature and Aaron's name as the sole beneficiary. I hit send. I immediately dialed the direct line of my attorney, Jonathan. 30 years ago, I paid Jonathan's entire law school tuition when his own father abandoned him. He was a corporate litigator who treated the law like a blunt instrument of war. He was ruthless, brilliant, and entirely loyal to me. He answered on the first ring. "Jonathan," I said, my voice steady and cold, "I just sent you a secure file containing a life insurance policy taken out on Sylvia. The signature is a forgery. Aaron and Megan just used a fake medical power of attorney to lock me out of the hospital." "I am opening the file now," Jonathan replied, the typing on his keyboard sounding like rapid gunfire. "What are my orders, Wendell?" "I need you to run a forensic financial audit on Megan's technology startup," I commanded. "I also need you to pull the property and loan records for their house in Knoxville. Tear their lives apart and find the debt." I sat in the cab of my truck watching the hospital entrance through the rain-streaked windshield. My phone vibrated against the center console. Jonathan did not waste time with basic greetings. His voice cut through the speaker, crisp and loaded with professional malice. He had spent the last 2 hours dissecting Megan's technology startup. The company was nothing but a hollow shell. She had leased a premium office space in downtown Knoxville and hired a dozen executives with bloated salaries. They produced absolutely no viable software. Megan was burning through cash at a catastrophic rate to maintain the illusion of success. Jonathan hacked through her sanitized public filings and found the hidden liabilities. She owed $250,000 to a syndicate of highly aggressive private equity investors based in Chicago. These were not patient venture capitalists. They were ruthless financial predators who dismantled lives when their payments were delayed. Megan had promised them a massive return on their initial seed money. Her deadline to deliver the principal was this coming Friday. If she defaulted, they would seize her corporate assets and personally bankrupt her. The panicked argument I had overheard in the hallway suddenly snapped into perfect focus. Megan was drowning. She demanded Aaron sell his boat to cover the immediate shortfall. Aaron refused because he knew a much larger sum was arriving soon. He knew Sylvia's life insurance policy would wipe out Megan's debt and leave them with a small fortune. They were using my wife's heartbeat as a ticking clock to balance their fraudulent ledgers. Jonathan paused his rapid delivery. He took a slow breath. He told me the tech startup was merely the surface of their deception. The real crime involved the ground beneath my feet. I stared at the dark hospital building, bracing myself for whatever Jonathan had uncovered next. He explained that he had pulled the public property records for Aaron and Megan's sprawling Knoxville estate. The house sat on a 2-acre lot in a gated community featuring custom stonework and a heated pool. I knew Aaron's salary as a mid-level logistics manager could never secure a property of that magnitude. Jonathan confirmed my suspicion. Aaron possessed a dismal credit score ruined by years of reckless spending and failed investments I had refused to bail him out of. He lacked the financial credibility to buy a simple storage shed, let alone a luxury estate. Megan carried an even worse financial history shadowed by her bleeding startup. The banks had categorically rejected their initial loan applications. They required a primary guarantor with impeccable credit and substantial liquid assets. Jonathan navigated the county clerk's database and extracted the final closing documents. The Knoxville deed listed Aaron and Megan as the primary residents, but the financial burden rested entirely on someone else. Jonathan forwarded a heavily encrypted PDF file directly to my phone. I opened the document. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, the complex amortization schedules, and the immense liability clauses. The principal loan amount was an even $1 million. The sheer scale of their theft made my chest tighten. They had not just bypassed the bank's rejection, they had bypassed my lifelong refusal to finance their delusions of grandeur. Jonathan stayed completely silent on the line, letting the gravity of the paperwork sink in. I scrolled to the final page of the digital file. I knew exactly what I was going to find before the image fully rendered on my glowing screen. My name was printed clearly at the bottom of the signature page. Above the printed text rested a flawless replication of my personal signature. I zoomed in on the dark blue ink strokes. 40 years of signing repair contracts and heavy machinery manifests had given my handwriting a distinct aggressive slant. Aaron had spent his entire childhood watching me sign checks and invoices. He knew every loop and hard angle of my penmanship. He had practiced it. He had perfected it. He had walked into a Knoxville bank, presented falsified financial statements, and forged my name to secure a $1 million mortgage. I was legally bound as the primary guarantor. If Aaron and Megan defaulted on their payments, the bank possessed the absolute right to seize my business, my home in Atlanta, and every dollar of my retirement savings. They had weaponized my identity to fund their luxury lifestyle. They had stolen my financial security while plotting to murder my wife for a second windfall. The sheer depth of their betrayal defied basic human logic. They were not merely greedy children making terrible mistakes. They were calculated predators. Jonathan's voice broke through the silence of the truck cabin. He sounded furious. He informed me that the notary who stamped the mortgage document was a former college roommate of Aaron's. They had orchestrated a complete criminal conspiracy. Jonathan demanded permission to strike. He was already drafting a formal injunction. He wanted to march into the local police precinct, present the forged documents, and have Aaron and Megan arrested before sunrise. He promised to freeze their assets and drag them out of their house in handcuffs. I gripped the steering wheel, letting the anger surge and then deliberately pushing it down. I instructed Jonathan to hold his fire. I expressly forbade him from calling the police or filing the injunction. Jonathan argued vehemently. He stated that every hour we delayed gave them an opportunity to destroy evidence or secure their stolen assets. I cut him off. I explained that arresting them tonight would be a catastrophic tactical error. If the police dragged them out of their house right now, they would immediately invoke their right to legal counsel. Megan's wealthy parents in Chicago would hire elite defense attorneys. They would claim Aaron had my verbal permission to sign the mortgage. They would argue Sylvia's saline injection was a tragic mistake born of immense stress. They would muddy the waters with technicalities and sympathetic narratives. I refused to give them a fighting chance in a courtroom. I needed them absolutely defenseless. I told Jonathan that predators are most vulnerable when they believe they have successfully cornered their prey. Aaron and Megan thought I was a terrified, confused old man paralyzed by grief. They believed they held absolute control over Sylvia's medical care and my financial future. I wanted them to gorge on that false sense of invincibility. I wanted them to feel so secure that they became reckless. I needed them to drop their guard completely and make a fatal error. We would not strike them with a sudden arrest. We would slowly dismantle their lives until they had nowhere left to run. I ordered Jonathan to draft the fraud lawsuits but lock them securely in his desk. The silent adjustment required perfect timing. I ended the call and stared at the glowing hospital windows. Tomorrow I would walk back inside and play the perfect victim. I sat in my rented motel room staring at the peeling wallpaper when my phone broke the quiet. The caller ID displayed Aaron's name. I answered immediately, maintaining my manufactured facade of a broken, grieving husband. Aaron did not offer a standard greeting. His voice was brisk, infused with a synthetic urgency carefully designed to trigger a panic response. He claimed the hospital administration had just handed him a severe financial ultimatum. According to Aaron, Sylvia's private intensive care suite was not fully covered by her standard Medicare policy. He stated the billing department required an immediate $10,000 deposit to keep her connected to the specialized life support machines. I asked him what would happen if we could not produce the funds. Aaron did not hesitate. He told me the hospital would forcibly transfer her to a state-run overflow facility by the end of the day. He painted a vivid, terrifying picture of absolute neglect, claiming she would be left to deteriorate on a gurney in a crowded hallway without proper monitoring. He was directly leveraging his mother's life to extort capital. He needed a rapid cash injection to hold off Megan's private equity investors until the $500,000 insurance check cleared. I let a long, trembling silence stretch across the phone line. I squeezed my eyes shut, channeling the immense exhaustion of the past 24 hours into my voice. I begged him not to authorize the transfer. I promised him I would liquidate my emergency savings fund and wire the money directly to his personal checking account within the hour. Aaron let out a heavy, theatrical sigh of relief. He praised me for stepping up. He promised he would handle the hospital billing office personally. I hung up the phone. The extortion was officially complete. I drove straight to the nearest local branch of my national bank. I walked through the heavy glass doors with my shoulders slumped and my gaze fixed firmly on the floor. I approached the branch manager's desk and introduced myself with a frantic, trembling voice. I explained that my wife was lying in a diabetic coma at the local hospital, and my son urgently needed a $10,000 wire transfer to prevent her from being moved to a substandard state ward. The manager looked at me with deep, genuine sympathy. She quickly pulled up my account profiles and initiated the high-speed transfer protocol. I made sure to emphasize the exact reason for the transaction loudly enough for the surrounding bank tellers to hear. I leaned over the mahogany desk and requested that the manager type a specific, highly detailed memo onto the official wire document. I instructed her to write that the funds were expressly for Sylvia's private intensive care medical deposit. I watched her fingers fly across the keyboard, permanently encoding Aaron's extortion into the federal banking system. I asked for 3 physically stamped copies of the transaction receipt. I wanted indisputable physical evidence linking my liquid cash directly to his personal bank account. The manager handed me the receipts, offering her heartfelt prayers for my wife's recovery. I thanked her profusely and walked out of the bank. I sat inside the cab of my truck and photographed the stamped documents. I sent the encrypted images directly to Jonathan. This $10,000 wire transfer was not a rescue fund. It was the financial rope Aaron would eventually use to hang himself. By formalizing the transaction through a bank manager under the guise of an emergency medical deposit, I secured ironclad proof of wire fraud. I drove back to the Knoxville estate just as the sun dipped below the tree line. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles. I parked my heavy work truck behind a sleek silver sports car. I walked up the manicured path and found the front door slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped into a booming celebration. Bass-heavy music vibrated through the hardwood floors. A dozen well-dressed guests crowded the expansive living room. The scent of expensive catering, roasted meats, and exotic perfumes entirely masked the stale rot I had smelled just yesterday. I moved silently through the entryway. No one noticed the tired old man standing in the shadows. I looked toward the massive kitchen island. Megan stood at the center of the room holding a crystal flute filled with sparkling champagne. She raised her glass high above her head, commanding the attention of her wealthy friends. She beamed with absolute radiance. She announced that her technology startup had miraculously secured an emergency round of bridge funding that very afternoon. The guests cheered loudly and raised their glasses in unison. Megan took a long, triumphant sip of the champagne. She was drinking a vintage bought directly with the $10,000 I had wired for Sylvia's life support. She was celebrating her temporary financial salvation, utterly blind to the reality that she was spending wire fraud money. Aaron stood beside the stainless steel refrigerator, smiling nervously as he accepted congratulations from a man in a tailored suit. They were hosting a victory party while the woman who gave Aaron life lay comatose on a ventilator 3 miles away. The sheer depravity of the scene cemented my resolve. I did not possess a single shred of mercy for either of them. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the center of the bright kitchen. The music seemed to drop a decibel as the guests finally noticed my muddy work boots and grease-stained jacket. Aaron spotted me. His fake smile collapsed instantly. He rushed forward, grabbing my elbow to steer me away from his wealthy guests. He hissed under his breath, demanding to know why I was not resting at the motel. I kept my voice loud and perfectly steady, ensuring the nearest guests could hear my response. I told him I could not sleep because I was too deeply worried about his mother. I explained that I just came to fetch Sylvia's favorite knitted blanket from the guest room so she would have something warm and familiar when she woke up. Aaron's tense shoulders dropped slightly. He released my elbow and nodded with stiff, forced compassion. He told me to grab the blanket and go straight back to the motel to rest. I walked past the staring partygoers and ascended the grand staircase. The heavy bass of the music muffled my footsteps completely. I bypassed the guest room entirely. I walked straight down the carpeted hallway and slipped into their master suite. The room was immaculate. I moved directly into their expansive master bathroom. I locked the heavy oak door behind me. I needed the physical mechanism of their crime. I needed the exact tool they used to empty Sylvia's prescription insulin pen and replace it with fatal saline. I began a systematic search of the space. I did not touch their toothbrushes or their neatly folded towels. I opened the dual vanity cabinets and scanned the pristine glass shelves. I moved methodically, leaving absolutely no trace of my presence. The murder weapon had to be hidden somewhere in this room. I closed the heavy oak door of the master bathroom and locked it with a sharp, definitive click. The space was a monument to superficial luxury lined with imported Italian marble and polished chrome fixtures. I did not waste time marveling at the excess. I went straight for the massive dual vanity. I pulled open the top drawers, shoving aside perfectly rolled hand towels and expensive artisan soaps. I found nothing. I dropped to my knees and threw open the lower cabinet doors. The space beneath the sink was meticulously organized. I pushed past sealed boxes of designer cosmetics and large bottles of premium hair products. My hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a mechanic diagnosing a cracked engine block. I reached into the darkest back corner of the cabinet, my fingers brushing against the cold drywall. I felt a cluster of heavy glass bottles. I pulled them forward. They were imported French perfumes standing like a fragrant crystalline wall. I reached behind them and my fingers grazed a thick plastic bag taped directly to the back of the cabinet wall. I ripped the tape free and pulled the bag into the bright vanity lighting. My chest tightened as I stared at the contents. Inside the clear plastic lay 3 small glass vials. Their labels indicated they were medical-grade saline solution. They were completely empty. Resting right beside the empty glass vials was a standard medical syringe with a fine-gauge needle. The plunger was pushed all the way to the bottom. This was the exact mechanism of their betrayal. This was the precise tool Megan used to drain my wife's life-saving insulin and replace it with useless salt water. I stared at the plastic bag, my vision narrowing into a tunnel of cold, absolute rage. I folded the plastic bag tightly and shoved it deep into the inner pocket of my heavy canvas work jacket. I stood up from the marble floor, brushed the dust from my knees, and checked my reflection in the massive vanity mirror. My face gave away nothing. I unlocked the master bathroom door and stepped back into the hallway. The heavy bass of the celebration downstairs vibrated through the floorboards, guiding me back toward the kitchen. I descended the grand staircase with deliberate, measured steps. The party was still in full swing. Megan was laughing loudly, tossing her head back as one of her wealthy investors told a joke. I walked straight through the crowd, holding Sylvia's knitted blanket tightly against my chest like a shield. Megan caught my eye across the kitchen island. Her laughter faltered for a fraction of a second. I gave her a slow, polite nod. I played the part of the broken, exhausted father perfectly. She returned the nod, her fake smile instantly snapping back into place, completely satisfied that I was leaving her house without causing a scene. I walked out the front door and descended the driveway. I climbed into my truck, tossed the blanket onto the passenger seat, and locked the doors. I pulled the plastic bag from my pocket and set it on the center console. I started the engine and drove away from the Knoxville estate. I did not head back to the motel. I drove directly toward a bleak industrial park on the outskirts of the city. Jonathan had texted me an address earlier that evening. It belonged to a former federal agent turned private investigator. Jonathan assured me this man operated entirely in the shadows and possessed the exact skills I needed. I parked my truck in front of a nondescript cinderblock building. A flickering neon sign in the window cast a harsh yellow glow over the wet pavement. I walked inside and found the private investigator sitting behind a battered metal desk. His name was Marcus. He possessed the hard, cynical eyes of a man who had spent decades dissecting human deception. I placed the plastic bag directly on his desk. Marcus pulled on a pair of black latex gloves, unsealed the bag, and carefully examined the empty saline vials and the used syringe under a bright desk lamp. He turned the glass vials over, inspecting the labels and the punctured rubber stoppers. He set the bag down and looked at me with a grim, uncompromising expression. He told me this physical evidence was completely useless in a court of law. My jaw tightened. I demanded to know how the literal murder weapon could be considered useless. Marcus explained the brutal reality of the legal system. He stated that without clear fingerprints or video evidence proving Megan injected the saline, a skilled defense attorney would obliterate my narrative. A high-priced lawyer would simply argue that Sylvia, suffering from alleged diabetic confusion, purchased the saline herself and made a tragic medical error. They would claim I was a grieving, vindictive husband looking for a scapegoat. The physical items proved nothing on their own. We needed unassailable proof of their malicious intent. Marcus leaned across the metal desk, his voice dropping to a low, serious register. He told me the only way to bypass a wealthy defense team was to secure an explicit, undeniable audio confession. We needed Megan to admit her guilt out loud, describing the exact mechanics of her crime without any coercion or physical threats. I looked at the empty vials resting on the metal desk and nodded. I told Marcus I was completely prepared to do whatever was necessary to secure the confession. He stood up and walked over to a heavy steel safe in the corner of his office. He retrieved a small, highly sophisticated audio recording device and a coil of medical-grade adhesive tape. The microphone was smaller than a dime, connected to a flat digital transmitter. Marcus instructed me to unbutton my heavy canvas jacket and my flannel shirt. He taped the microphone directly to the center of my chest, burying the small black wire beneath my collarbone. He secured the transmitter securely against my ribcage, ensuring it would not shift or rustle against my clothing. He flipped a tiny switch on the side of the device. A microscopic green light blinked once, indicating the recorder was actively capturing every sound in the room. He handed me a remote detonator disguised as a standard automotive key fob. I slipped it into my pocket. Marcus warned me that Megan was highly intelligent and deeply guarded. She would never confess if she felt she was being interrogated. I told him I did not plan to interrogate her. I planned to execute a targeted psychological assault. I knew Megan's ultimate weakness was her towering, fragile arrogance. She despised being underestimated, and she fiercely protected her self-image as a brilliant, untouchable entrepreneur. I intended to attack her ego with absolute precision. I would corner her, threaten the one thing she valued above human life, and push her until her rage overrode her caution. I thanked Marcus, buttoned my shirt, and walked out into the cold night air. I was fully armed, and I was going to break her completely. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the Knoxville hospital as the sun rose. The microphone taped to my chest felt like a block of ice against my skin. I navigated the sterile corridors and took the elevator to the intensive care floor. Aaron and Megan were sitting in the waiting area, drinking expensive coffees. I approached them with my shoulders deliberately slumped, maintaining the facade of a defeated old man. I looked at Aaron and told him to go sit by Sylvia's bed. I insisted that Sylvia needed to hear her son's voice. Aaron eagerly complied, desperate to project the image of a devoted child in front of the nursing staff. Once Aaron disappeared behind the heavy double doors of the ICU, I turned to Megan. I asked her to join me in the cafeteria on the ground floor. I claimed I needed to discuss the mounting medical bills and needed her financial advice. Megan sighed loudly, clearly irritated by the request. She checked the glowing screen of her smartwatch and told me she only had 10 minutes before a critical conference call with her investors. We rode the elevator down in complete silence. The cafeteria was mostly empty at this early hour, populated only by a few exhausted nurses and cleaning staff. I selected a small circular table in the far corner, entirely isolated from any security cameras or listening ears. Megan sat across from me and crossed her arms over her expensive silk blouse. She stared at me with an expression of profound boredom. She told me to get straight to the point because she did not have time for sentimental family drama. She remained completely unaware of the blinking green light hidden beneath my flannel shirt. I dropped the exhausted father routine instantly. I straightened my back and locked my eyes directly onto hers. The sudden shift in my posture made her blink in genuine surprise. I did not ask about the hospital bills. I spoke with brutal, absolute clarity. I told Megan that I was contacting my corporate attorney in Atlanta immediately. I informed her that I was completely restructuring my estate and executing a new will by the end of the week. I stated that Aaron was being removed as a beneficiary entirely. He would not receive a single dollar from my accounts, nor would he inherit any fraction of my properties. Megan uncrossed her arms, her bored expression vanishing into a mask of sudden alarm. I did not stop there. I pushed the blade deeper. I told her that I was contacting a direct competitor in the heavy machinery sector. I planned to liquidate my entire Atlanta repair business for cash within 30 days. I explained that I would take the millions generated from the sale and place them into an irrevocable trust designated solely for Sylvia's long-term medical care. I told her my attorney had already intercepted her digital files. He cracked her secure server and downloaded her internal company ledgers. I looked her dead in the eye and told her I knew all about the encrypted file named Kichban Ong Deden 2_11.docx, where she hid her massive private equity debts. I also knew about the forged loan application named Kichban Ong Deden Mao 1_11.docx she used to secure the Knoxville house. Her golden parachute was disintegrating before her eyes. The millions she counted on to salvage her fraudulent tech startup were being locked away permanently. The sheer bluntness of my attack shattered her carefully maintained facade. Megan lost her temper completely. Her face flushed an angry crimson. She slammed her hand flat against the cheap laminate table, causing her coffee cup to rattle loudly. She sneered at me, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. She told me I was nothing but a grease-stained mechanic playing at being a businessman. She mocked my 40 years of labor in Atlanta, calling my repair shop a pathetic relic of a dead economy. She leaned across the table and called me an absolute dinosaur who understood absolutely nothing about modern wealth or corporate leveraging. She bragged that her tech company was built on sophisticated algorithms and venture capital concepts my blue-collar brain could never comprehend. She claimed my millions were trivial compared to the ultimate valuation of her startup. I let her vent. I let her arrogance inflate the room. I knew her entire company was a hollow shell drowning in high-interest debt, but I did not interrupt her tirade. I needed her to feel vastly superior. I needed her ego to eclipse her rational thought process completely. She spat that Aaron was weak for ever seeking my approval. She told me my money was meant to serve a greater purpose, to fund real innovation, rather than rot in a conservative trust fund for a dying woman. Her arrogance was towering, highly fragile, and utterly toxic. She was practically vibrating with rage, deeply offended that a mechanic dared to dictate the terms of her financial survival. I stared back at her without blinking. Her insults meant absolutely nothing to me. They were just the necessary fuel to push her toward the precipice. I had her exactly where I wanted her. I pushed her one final step toward the edge. I leaned across the table until my face was inches from hers. I lowered my voice to a sharp, penetrating whisper. I told her that Sylvia was a fighter. I assured her that the lead specialist was confident my wife would pull through this coma within the week. I stated that the moment Sylvia opened her eyes and regained her speech, she would call her own lawyers. She would legally revoke the fraudulent life insurance policy Aaron had secretly purchased. She would testify about the missing backup medication and the sudden illness. I promised Megan that Sylvia would financially ruin them both before she even left her hospital bed. That was the breaking point. Pushed to the absolute brink of financial ruin, Megan's caution evaporated entirely. Her eyes flared with a manic, cornered desperation. She let out a sharp, breathless laugh that carried zero humor. She sneered at me with absolute contempt. She told me Sylvia was never waking up to sign another legal document. She leaned in closer, her voice practically vibrating against the hidden microphone taped to my chest. She explicitly bragged about walking into the kitchen while Sylvia was sleeping. She described in graphic detail how she took the medical syringe and drained every single drop of insulin from the prescription pen. She boasted about refilling the plastic reservoir with sterile saline solution to ensure the autopsy would look like a natural diabetic failure. She claimed it was a flawless, untraceable adjustment designed to secure Aaron's inheritance quickly. She smiled fully, believing she had committed the perfect murder to save her fraudulent company. The microphone captured every single syllable of her confession in pristine digital audio. The trap had snapped shut. Megan's final syllable still hung in the sterile cafeteria air when the heavy double doors swung open. Aaron marched into the room, his dress shoes clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. He looked flushed and deeply agitated, entirely unaware of the lethal admission his wife had just broadcast into my hidden microphone. He zeroed in on our corner table and crossed the room with long, aggressive strides. He did not ask how our conversation was proceeding. He bypassed pleasantries entirely. Aaron reached out and grabbed my left shoulder, his fingers digging forcefully into my collarbone. He intended to physically haul me out of the plastic chair and drag me back to the intensive care waiting area to maintain his fabricated image of family unity. He yanked upward. His rough grip snagged the thick fabric of my flannel shirt. As his thumb slipped beneath the collar, his knuckles brushed against the rigid edge of the medical-grade adhesive tape holding the transmitter wire to my chest. He froze. The sudden tactile anomaly broke his aggressive momentum. He looked down, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He tightened his grip and forcefully dragged his thumb across the hidden wire a second time. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The color drained from his face instantly. His eyes darted from my chest to Megan, who was still wearing her triumphant, arrogant smirk. Aaron looked back at me, his pupils wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. He recognized the shape of the wire beneath the fabric. He understood exactly what I was wearing. The absolute certainty that I had just captured every single word of their murderous conspiracy crashed down upon him. He knew their perfect crime was completely ruined. Aaron let out a guttural, terrifying sound that barely resembled a human voice. The sheer magnitude of the impending prison sentence shattered his carefully cultivated corporate demeanor. He did not demand an explanation. He lunged across the small circular table with absolute feral desperation. His hands formed into claws, violently grabbing the front of my flannel shirt. He pulled backward with all his body weight, attempting to rip the fabric open and tear the recording device directly from my skin. The sudden explosive violence of his attack sent our table crashing sideways. Megan shrieked and scrambled backward, her chair tipping over onto the hard floor. I braced my boots against the linoleum and shoved him back, but the sheer panic gave him a surge of manic energy. We collided heavily and spilled out of the isolated corner into the main cafeteria thoroughfare. Aaron swung wildly, his fists striking my chest and shoulders as he clawed at my collar. We slammed into a nearby dining cart. A stack of plastic trays and ceramic coffee mugs shattered across the tiles in an ear-splitting cascade of noise. Startled nurses and hospital staff screamed, scrambling out of our path. Aaron ignored the growing crowd entirely. His singular consuming focus was the destruction of the audio transmitter. He grabbed a handful of my shirt and yanked downward, popping the buttons off the fabric in a rapid succession of sharp snaps. The black wire connecting the microphone to the transmitter unit became partially exposed against my collarbone. Aaron saw the wire and let out another frantic roar. He abandoned striking me and drove both of his hands toward my throat, desperate to rip the electronics apart before the digital file could be secured. I did not retreat. I did not cower or raise my arms to shield my face from his frantic assault. My son fundamentally underestimated the man he was attacking. Aaron spent his entire adult life sitting in ergonomic office chairs, typing emails and signing forged documents. I spent the last 40 years pulling apart seized diesel engines, hauling steel transmission blocks, and wrestling heavy machinery back into alignment. My muscles were dense, hardened by decades of relentless manual labor. When Aaron drove his hands toward my throat to grasp the exposed wire, I reacted with cold, mechanical precision. I stepped directly into his downward momentum and brought my left arm up, blocking his desperate lunge. I opened my right hand and clamped my thick, calloused fingers around his advancing wrist. The moment I secured my grip, the dynamic of the fight shifted completely. I squeezed my hand shut like an industrial vice. Aaron let out a sharp gasp of pain as my fingers dug deeply into his tendons. I planted my left work boot firmly onto the slick linoleum floor, anchoring my center of gravity. I twisted his arm outward and bent his wrist backward at a severe, unnatural angle. He cried out, his knees buckling instantly as the intense pressure forced his body downward. He thrashed wildly, kicking his expensive leather shoes against my shins, but I did not yield a single inch. I locked my arm in place, holding him in a punishing joint lock that neutralized his attack completely. I kept my chest angled away from his free hand, ensuring the microphone and the transmitter remained perfectly safe. I stood tall amidst the shattered coffee mugs and overturned trays, easily restraining the man who had tried to murder my wife. The blare of a handheld radio cut through the chaotic cafeteria. 3 hospital security guards sprinted down the corridor, their heavy boots slamming against the floor tiles. They burst into the dining area and immediately assessed the violent scene. They saw a large, grease-stained mechanic physically dominating a well-dressed corporate manager. Megan seized the opportunity with venomous speed. She scrambled up from the floor, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. "Help us!" Megan screamed at the top of her lungs, projecting an image of absolute hysterical terror. This demented old man just attacked my husband completely unprovoked. He is suffering from a violent psychotic break. He is trying to kill him. The guards did not hesitate or ask for context. They reacted to the immediate physical threat and Megan's frantic accusations. The largest guard charged forward and wrapped his thick arms around my waist, driving his shoulder forcefully into my ribs. The impact broke my iron grip on Aaron's wrist. The second guard grabbed my right arm and twisted it behind my back in a standard submission hold. I did not fight them. I did not resist their authority or shout my innocence to the horrified onlookers. The recording was safely secured against my ribs, actively transmitting the digital file to Marcus. Resisting security would only validate Megan's fabricated narrative. I went entirely limp, allowing the 3 guards to tackle me against the nearest unmarred table. Aaron scrambled away, clutching his sprained wrist against his chest, panting heavily. The head security officer snapped a pair of heavy plastic zip ties around my wrists, securing them tightly behind my back. They hauled me upright and marched me out of the cafeteria, dragging me toward an isolated holding room in the basement. The hospital holding room was a windowless concrete box. I sat on a rigid plastic chair for exactly 2 hours before Jonathan arrived with a stack of release papers. He did not ask how I felt. He simply handed me a pen and informed me that our psychological assault had yielded an unexpected tactical advantage. Aaron had taken my calculated bait and sprinted directly into a legal trap. Before the hospital security even finished filing their incident report, Aaron contacted his attorneys. He leveraged the cafeteria altercation to file an emergency ex parte motion in family court. He demanded permanent legal guardianship over my person and my estate. The filing was a masterpiece of fabricated desperation. Aaron claimed I was suffering from rapid violent dementia, using the chaotic fight as irrefutable proof of my cognitive collapse. He painted a picture of a terrified son forced to restrain an erratic, dangerous father. The emergency petition requested the immediate freezing of all my financial accounts, the suspension of my business licenses, and the transfer of my medical proxy directly into his hands. He wanted absolute, unchecked control over my life by the end of the week. He believed the guardianship would give him the legal authority to silence Sylvia's medical care and seize the heavy machinery company in Atlanta before I could sell it. Jonathan smiled as he outlined the sheer arrogance of the motion. Aaron had bypassed all standard medical protocols and rushed the filing, relying entirely on the shock value of the hospital security report. He was legally cornering himself, binding his lies to a sworn federal affidavit. We left the hospital without saying another word. The trap was set, and the courtroom would serve as the execution block. The family court hearing convened just 3 days later in a somber wood-paneled room. I sat silently at the heavy oak defense table. I wore a simple faded suit, deliberately cultivating the image of an exhausted, deteriorating old man. Jonathan sat to my right, his posture completely relaxed. He looked entirely unbothered by the severe allegations listed in the federal docket before him. Across the aisle, Aaron and Megan sat with their high-priced litigation team. Aaron wore a tailored charcoal suit, projecting the solemn gravity of a dutiful son burdened by tragedy. When the judge called the court to order, Aaron immediately took the witness stand. He delivered a rehearsed, tearful monologue designed to evoke maximum sympathy. He spoke with a trembling voice about my sudden aggressive outbursts and my supposed inability to comprehend reality. He wiped a single, perfectly timed tear from his cheek as he described the cafeteria assault. He claimed I hallucinated a threat and violently attacked him while he was simply trying to comfort me about his mother's medical condition. He spun a narrative of a proud patriarch tragically destroyed by the grief of a comatose wife. He told the judge that my mind had completely fractured under the pressure. Megan sat in the gallery, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the traumatized daughter-in-law. Aaron explicitly stated that I was actively endangering my own life and the financial stability of the family business. He pleaded with the judge to grant him the guardianship, insisting it was the only way to protect me from my own rapid mental decay. I listened to his perjury without blinking, letting his lies fill the official court record. Aaron stepped down from the witness stand, keeping his head bowed in a display of manufactured sorrow. His lead attorney immediately stood up to capitalize on the emotional momentum. The lawyer was a polished, aggressive litigator who moved with predatory confidence. He approached the judge's bench and delivered his final decisive argument. He demanded that the court immediately strip me of all my liquid assets, property deeds, and corporate holdings for my own absolute safety. He argued that allowing an unstable, violent man to retain control of a multi-million-dollar company posed an unacceptable risk to both the employees and the general public. He requested a temporary injunction to freeze my bank accounts and transfer full fiduciary control directly to Aaron by the end of the business day. The lawyer painted my financial independence as a lethal hazard, insisting that I lacked the basic cognitive function required to sign a simple check. He concluded his aggressive speech by asking the court to institutionalize me in a secure, locked psychiatric facility until a long-term care plan could be established. Aaron sat at the plaintiff's table, casting a brief, triumphant glance in my direction. He believed the performance was flawless. He thought he had successfully weaponized the legal system to complete his financial coup. The judge, an older woman with a stern, impassive face, adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the defense table. The heavy silence in the courtroom shifted. She turned her attention directly to Jonathan, clearly expecting a desperate plea for mercy or a frantic request for a medical delay. She braced herself for the standard defense of a confused, failing patriarch. Jonathan did not beg. He simply straightened his tie and stood up. Jonathan approached the center of the courtroom with a calm, lethal precision. He did not offer an emotional rebuttal. He handed the judge a sealed certified folder containing comprehensive medical documentation. He stated clearly for the official record that I had submitted to an exhaustive psychiatric evaluation by an independent court-approved specialist just 24 hours after the hospital incident. The judge broke the seal and scanned the dense medical jargon. Jonathan announced that the clinical results placed my cognitive function, memory retention, and logical reasoning in the top 1% for my age bracket. I was not suffering from dementia, paranoia, or any form of mental decay. My mind was sharp-focused and entirely competent. Aaron's lawyer jumped up to object, stammering about the violent assault in the cafeteria. Jonathan smoothly silenced him. He produced a small digital recorder and requested permission to enter a crucial piece of audio evidence into the record. The judge granted the motion. Jonathan pressed play. The pristine digital audio filled the silent courtroom. Aaron's voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls, frantic and aggressive, demanding Megan shut up as he physically attacked me to destroy the hidden wire. The recording clearly demonstrated Aaron initiating the violent struggle the moment he discovered I was documenting their crimes. The audio proved my actions were entirely defensive, an absolute necessity to protect a vital piece of evidence. The fabricated narrative of an unprovoked psychotic break collapsed instantly. The judge slammed her gavel down her face tight with absolute fury. She ordered Aaron's attorney to sit down. She dismissed the guardianship petition immediately with profound prejudice. She stared directly at Aaron, promising severe federal consequences for filing a perjured affidavit. The trap had closed. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind us, sealing Aaron and his high-priced legal team inside with their catastrophic failure. I walked down the marble corridor alongside Jonathan, the echo of our footsteps the only sound in the sterile hallway. We did not celebrate. The dismissal of the guardianship petition was merely a defensive maneuver. Now we transitioned to absolute offense. Jonathan pulled his smartphone from the inner pocket of his tailored suit. He did not break his stride. He tapped the screen twice, bypassed a biometric security prompt, and executed a sequence he had prepared days in advance. He looked over at me and gave a single sharp nod. The civil fraud lawsuit against Aaron and Megan was officially filed into the federal electronic docket. The lawsuit meticulously detailed the $1 million forged mortgage on the Knoxville estate. It included the high-resolution scans of the falsified signature, the compromised amortization schedules, and the sworn affidavit from the corrupt notary. It was a flawless legal torpedo aimed directly at the foundation of their stolen wealth. Jonathan explained that the filing instantly generated a digital shockwave through the county clerk's office. A massive legal lien was immediately attached to the Knoxville property. Aaron and Megan could not sell the house borrow against the equity or transfer the deed to a shell company. The real estate they had acquired by weaponizing my identity was now a frozen toxic asset. Jonathan slipped the phone back into his pocket as we pushed through the revolving glass doors of the courthouse. The morning air was crisp and biting. We had successfully defended my autonomy. It was time to systematically dismantle their financial life support. We stood on the courthouse steps as Jonathan executed the second phase of the strike. He dialed a direct unlisted number for the elite fraud prevention division at the National Bank. Jonathan possessed the legal authority to trigger an immediate asset lockdown due to the sheer magnitude of the forged mortgage and my status as the primary guarantor. He spoke to the federal compliance officer with cold, mechanical precision. He provided the docket number of the freshly filed civil lawsuit and authorized the deployment of a mandatory federal freeze on every account tangentially connected to Aaron and Megan. The execution was devastatingly fast. Within 30 minutes, the bank's automated algorithms swept through the financial network. They identified Aaron's primary checking account, Megan's corporate startup ledgers, and their joint high-yield savings portfolios. The system clamped down like a steel vault. Every single dollar they possessed was locked behind a federal mandate pending a comprehensive fraud investigation. Their direct deposits were suspended. Their automated bill payments were instantly rejected. The credit lines tied to Megan's tech company were reduced to zero. They possessed absolutely no liquid capital to buy groceries, purchase gasoline, or hire new defense attorneys. Jonathan ended the call and informed me the financial guillotine had dropped. They were entirely excommunicated from the modern banking system. The money they had stolen to fund their luxury lifestyle was trapped behind an impenetrable wall of legal red tape. They had built their entire arrogant facade on the assumption that they could manipulate the system indefinitely. We had just turned that system into a cage. They were currently standing in the center of their opulent million-dollar estate without the basic financial leverage to purchase a cup of coffee. The illusion of their untouchable wealth was permanently shattered. 3 miles away from the courthouse, Megan sat at the head of a long mahogany table inside Knoxville's most exclusive private dining club. She was completely oblivious to the legal and financial devastation descending upon her. She was hosting a critical luncheon with the ruthless Chicago private equity investors. She had gathered them to project absolute confidence, pouring vintage wine and promising massive returns on their initial seed money. She smiled radiantly, showcasing her fraudulent tech startup as a guaranteed goldmine. The investors ate expensive cuts of meat, listening to her pitch with predatory patience. When the plates were cleared, the head waiter approached Megan with a discreet leather folio containing the $3,000 catering bill. Megan did not break eye contact with her lead investor. She smoothly retrieved a heavy platinum corporate card from her designer handbag and placed it on the silver tray. The waiter bowed slightly and walked away. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned. His professional demeanor was strained. He leaned down and whispered that the card had been declined. Megan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She quickly blamed a strict bank security algorithm and handed him a second platinum card. The waiter returned a moment later, shaking his head. He informed her that the second card was also rejected. Megan's face flushed a deep, panicked crimson. She frantically dug into her wallet and produced 2 personal credit cards, handing them over with trembling fingers. The investors stopped talking. They watched her unravel with cold, calculating eyes. The waiter returned for the 3rd time and placed the cards back on the table. He announced loudly enough for the entire room to hear that every single account was entirely frozen. Megan sat in paralyzed silence, thoroughly exposed as a total fraud. I walked across the sprawling courthouse parking lot toward my truck, the gravel crunching loudly under my boots. Aaron burst out of the side exit of the building, his face pale and contorted with sheer panic. He sprinted across the pavement, completely abandoning the poised corporate persona he had maintained inside the courtroom. He intercepted me just as I reached for the driver's side door handle. He was clutching his smartphone in a trembling hand, staring at the screen in absolute disbelief. He demanded to know what was happening. He yelled that he had just tried to use his debit card at a vending machine inside the lobby, and the terminal rejected the transaction. He opened his mobile banking application, screaming that his available balance showed $0 across every single account. He frantically scrolled through error messages, insisting the bank had made a catastrophic administrative mistake. He grabbed the side mirror of my truck, begging me to authorize a temporary wire transfer so he could secure a hotel room. He had no idea his wife was currently trapped at a luxury restaurant, entirely unable to pay a massive catering bill. I looked at the man who had forged my signature and plotted to murder my wife for her life insurance. I did not raise my voice. I did not express anger, sorrow, or triumph. I stared him dead in the eye with the cold, immovable weight of absolute finality. I told him there was no bank error. I explained that I had officially filed the fraud lawsuit and triggered the federal freeze. I watched his breath catch in his throat as the reality of his total ruin crushed him. I opened my truck door and told him the adjustment had begun. The federal freeze was only the first tremor of their total collapse. By the time the markets opened the following morning, the meticulously guarded secrets of Megan's technology startup were completely exposed to the public. Jonathan had ensured the civil fraud lawsuit was immediately flagged by automated financial news algorithms. A prominent business journal published a scathing article detailing the forged million-dollar mortgage tied directly to Megan's corporate holding company. The fallout was instantaneous and utterly devastating. The Chicago private equity investors read the headlines before Megan even arrived at her leased downtown office. They did not wait for an explanation or entertain her desperate phone calls. They executed the punitive clauses buried deep within their original seed contracts. They pulled their remaining funding completely and initiated aggressive legal proceedings to seize her corporate assets. Megan's entire business model disintegrated within 2 hours. She possessed a dozen bloated executive salaries, a premium office lease, and absolutely zero viable software to sell to the market. The sudden withdrawal of the Chicago syndicate triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. Her secondary creditors panicked. They called in their high-interest loans, simultaneously demanding immediate repayment. Megan was left staring at a digital ledger bleeding red. She was personally liable for millions of dollars in corporate debt, and her platinum credit cards remained firmly locked behind the federal fraud investigation. She could not pay her employees her rent or her aggressive creditors. The flawless illusion of her entrepreneurial brilliance was reduced to a criminal punchline circulating through the local financial sector. She had built her empire on the assumption that she could endlessly leverage my stolen wealth to cover her failures. I had removed the foundation, and she was currently in a rapid, uncontrolled freefall. The financial ruin was absolute, stripping away her carefully manicured identity and leaving her entirely exposed. Megan drove her luxury sedan back to the Knoxville estate, her pristine corporate facade replaced by absolute feral panic. She found Aaron standing in the center of the expansive driveway, staring blankly at a foreclosure notice taped to their custom front door by a bank representative. Megan slammed her car into park and leaped out, leaving the engine running. She did not offer her husband comfort or seek a unified front to face their impending ruin. She directed the full explosive force of her rage directly at his chest. She screamed that her entire life was destroyed because of his pathetic incompetence. She mocked his inability to manage a simple grieving mechanic. She blamed him exclusively for failing to secure the life insurance payout and for allowing me to orchestrate a federal financial freeze right under his nose. Aaron tried to defend himself, stammering about the unexpected recording device and the ruthless speed of the civil lawsuit. Megan cut him off with a vicious, dismissive wave of her hand. She told him he was weak, a cowardly failure, who could not even execute a basic real estate forgery without leaving a massive paper trail. She screamed that she should never have tethered her brilliant future to a man who cowered before his own father. The carefully constructed alliance built on greed and stolen capital fractured entirely. Aaron shouted back, reminding her that draining the insulin pen was her masterstroke of genius. He threw her arrogance back in her face, completely abandoning the illusion of their partnership. The sprawling luxury estate they had stolen stood as a silent witness to the complete toxic shattering of their marriage. They were two cornered predators furiously turning their teeth upon each other. Neither possessed the loyalty or the moral fortitude to survive the devastating consequences of their shared criminality. Megan recognized that Aaron was a sinking ship and she possessed an absolute biological imperative to survive. She left him standing in the driveway, got back into her running vehicle, and drove straight back to downtown Knoxville. She did not seek out her own defense attorneys, knowing she lacked the retainers to secure their services. She walked directly into Jonathan's private law firm. She marched past the reception desk and demanded an immediate confidential audience with opposing counsel. Jonathan did not turn her away. He welcomed her into his heavy, oak-paneled office and allowed her to sit across from his wide desk. Megan did not waste time playing the victim or protesting her innocence. She treated the impending murder charges like a hostile corporate negotiation. She leaned forward and offered a comprehensive, highly transactional surrender. She promised to provide sworn testimony detailing exactly how Aaron orchestrated the $1 million mortgage forgery. She offered to hand over the digital logs, proving he knowingly weaponized my identity. She then escalated her offer to secure her absolute safety. She promised to testify that the fatal medical sabotage was entirely Aaron's concept. She offered to swear under oath that he was the one who emptied Sylvia's prescription insulin pen and filled it with useless saline to accelerate his inheritance. She was willing to feed her husband directly to the criminal justice system in exchange for full civil immunity. She demanded Jonathan drop the fraud lawsuit against her startup and unfreeze her personal accounts. She presented her betrayal with chilling sociopathic pragmatism, fully believing she could negotiate her way out of a murder conspiracy by sacrificing her only remaining ally to the authorities. She assumed her calculated deception would be enough to buy her freedom and restore her shattered wealth. Jonathan listened to her desperate, calculated pitch with a face carved from stone. He did not immediately reject her offer. Instead, he reached across the polished surface of his desk and tapped the screen of his desk phone. The speaker crackled to life, filling the quiet office with a low, steady hum of background noise. Jonathan had dialed my number the moment Megan walked into the building. I had listened to every single word of her treacherous negotiation from the front seat of my truck parked outside Sylvia's hospital. Megan's eyes widened in sudden stark terror as she realized she was speaking directly to the man whose wife she had tried to execute. Jonathan sat back in his leather chair and formally asked me if I wished to accept the proposed settlement. I spoke into the phone with a voice stripped of all emotion, cold and heavy as forged steel. I told Megan that she fundamentally misunderstood the nature of this conflict. I explained that I was not a venture capitalist looking for a strategic compromise or a quick return on investment. I did not care about her sworn testimony or her pathetic attempts to shift the blame entirely onto my son. I possessed the audio recording of her explicit confession, and her betrayal of Aaron merely confirmed the depth of her moral bankruptcy. I flatly refused her offer of immunity. I promised her that I would not stop until her fraudulent company was reduced to ash and her reputation was permanently destroyed. I told her I would burn her entire corporate empire to the ground alongside my son and ensure they both spent the rest of their natural lives locked inside a federal penitentiary. Jonathan calmly terminated the call. The finality of the silence left her completely defenseless. Aaron retreated to the Knoxville estate after our encounter in the courthouse parking lot. His mind was rapidly deteriorating under the crushing weight of his frozen bank accounts and impending federal charges. Megan returned to the house hours later, completely silent and visibly shaken from her failed negotiation at Jonathan's office. She made a fatal tactical error born of sheer exhaustion. She left her encrypted laptop open and unattended on the kitchen island while she went upstairs to pack a travel bag. Aaron's paranoia had reached a boiling point. He approached the glowing screen and systematically bypassed her basic security locks. He opened her email client and found the digital trail of her ultimate betrayal. He read the sent messages addressed directly to Jonathan's law firm. The text was glaring and unambiguous. Megan explicitly offered to testify that the forged $1 million mortgage and the lethal insulin sabotage were entirely his ideas. She was actively selling him to the criminal justice system in exchange for a plea deal and civil immunity. Aaron stared at the screen as the final remnants of his sanity fractured completely. The woman he had worshipped, the partner he had committed murder for, was feeding him to the wolves to save her corporate reputation. He did not confront her immediately. His panic mutated into a cold, destructive rage. He moved silently through the massive luxury home. He engaged the deadbolts on the heavy oak front doors and secured the sliding glass panels leading to the patio. He systematically locked every single exit on the ground floor. He was sealing them inside the fraudulent monument they had built together. The million-dollar estate instantly transformed into an inescapable concrete vault. Megan came down the grand staircase carrying a leather duffel bag, fully intending to abandon her husband to the federal authorities. She walked toward the front entryway and grabbed the brass handle of the main door. It did not budge. She turned around and found Aaron standing at the end of the hallway. His eyes were wide, feral, and completely devoid of reason. He held her laptop in his right hand. He quoted her emails verbatim, reciting her treacherous offers of immunity with a chilling, detached precision. Megan realized her escape route was severed. She dropped the duffel bag and lunged toward the kitchen, sprinting for the rear garage access. Aaron moved with terrifying speed. He intercepted her before she reached the threshold, grabbing her roughly by the shoulders and hurling her backward into the living room. Megan scrambled to her feet and began screaming frantically for help. Her shrieks echoed off the imported marble floors and penetrated the thick glass windows. Aaron ignored her cries. He began dragging heavy pieces of custom furniture across the hardwood, barricading the exits with massive oak dining chairs and heavy iron lamps. The violent commotion shattered the quiet tranquility of the gated community. An elderly neighbor walking his dog heard the desperate, sustained screaming and immediately called emergency services. Within 10 minutes, the wail of approaching sirens sliced through the evening air. 3 local police cruisers tore up the manicured driveway, their red and blue lights flashing against the stone facade of the estate. Officers drew their weapons and took defensive positions behind their engine blocks. They ordered Aaron to open the door over a heavy megaphone. Aaron responded by smashing a chair against the front window, effectively declaring a state of absolute siege. I arrived at the scene shortly after the perimeter was established. The street was choked with emergency vehicles, fire engines, and a heavily armored tactical command truck. I parked my vehicle behind a barricade and walked toward the flashing lights, my boots grinding against the asphalt. A police chief recognized me from the initial reports and pulled me behind the safety of a squad car. He briefed me on the escalating crisis with grim efficiency. He explained that Aaron had completely lost contact with reality. My son had broken into the garage supply closet and retrieved 2 large metal canisters of highly flammable chemical solvents used for stripping paint. He had poured the toxic liquid across the hardwood floors of the living room and down the grand staircase. The chief informed me that Aaron was holding a lighter and threatening to burn the million-dollar house to the ground with both of them trapped inside. He was screaming that if the banks and the lawyers were going to take his wealth, he would reduce the entire estate to a pile of toxic ash. The standoff stretched into the dark hours of the night. Hostage negotiators attempted to establish a line of communication using a specialized field telephone, but Aaron refused to engage. He paced back and forth behind the shattered front window, wildly gesturing and shouting incoherent threats at the armed officers outside. The psychological toll of the prolonged siege was palpable. The air grew thick with the acrid stench of spilled chemicals venting through the broken glass. I stood in the cold night air watching the manic collapse of the boy I had raised. I felt absolutely no pity. I was simply waiting for the inevitable conclusion to his greed. The tactical stalemate broke from an entirely unexpected direction. Mr. Gallagher, a no-nonsense retired military veteran who lived directly next door, had been watching the chaotic spectacle from his front porch for over 3 hours. He thoroughly despised Aaron and Megan for their arrogant behavior and endless loud parties. He finally lost his patience with the theatrical standoff. Mr. Gallagher bypassed the yellow police tape completely. He marched straight across his immaculate lawn, picked up a heavy solid concrete landscaping brick from his garden border, and hurled it with tremendous force directly through the remnants of Aaron's massive front bay window. The heavy brick smashed through the remaining glass with a deafening explosive crash, spraying jagged shards across the ruined hardwood floor. The sudden violent distraction worked perfectly. Aaron flinched and dropped his lighter, his attention snapping entirely away from the hostages and the gasoline. He rushed toward the broken window, screaming furiously at the elderly neighbor for damaging his property. His fragile focus was entirely shattered. The tactical commander did not waste a single second. He issued a sharp, immediate order over the radio. A heavily armed SWAT unit utilized the noise of the breaking glass to execute a flawless breach at the rear of the house. They smashed the reinforced kitchen door inward with a steel battering ram and flooded the ground floor. Aaron spun around completely disoriented by the sudden intrusion. 3 tactical officers tackled him simultaneously, driving his face hard into the floorboards. They pinned his arms behind his back and secured him with heavy steel cuffs. The standoff was over. I watched the officers drag my son out of the front door in chains, his empire officially reduced to rubble. Aaron spent his first night in a federal holding cell, entirely stripped of his tailored suits and his fabricated authority. The sudden silence of his concrete cage offered no protection from the legal storm Jonathan and I were actively orchestrating on the outside. We did not pause to revel in the sight of my son being hauled away in steel cuffs. We moved immediately to secure the final devastating phase of our financial counteroffensive. While the authorities processed Aaron's extensive list of felony charges, I turned my absolute focus toward Megan. She had attempted to sell her husband for civil immunity, fully expecting to walk away with her corporate startup intact. I intended to dismantle that delusion permanently. I contacted my chief financial officer in Atlanta and authorized the immediate liquidation of 3 high-yield corporate bonds tied to my heavy machinery company. The influx of massive, untraceable capital provided Jonathan with the exact leverage we required. He initiated a direct conference call with the lead partner of the Chicago private equity syndicate. The investors were already hemorrhaging cash and desperate to completely sever their ties to Megan's toxic, fraud-laden enterprise. They viewed her corporate debt as an unrecoverable liability. Jonathan offered them an immediate clean exit. He proposed to purchase their entire stake in Megan's startup, acquiring the full weight of her $300,000 debt. The Chicago syndicate did not hesitate. They transferred the comprehensive debt portfolio directly into my holding company within 2 hours. They signed away all covenants, liabilities, and enforcement rights. I was no longer just the aggrieved father-in-law. I was legally and officially Megan's primary financial creditor, holding the absolute power of ruin over her life's work. The acquisition of the debt fundamentally shifted the balance of power. Megan had built her entire entrepreneurial identity on the illusion of absolute control, completely ignoring the lethal fine print buried deep within her original seed funding contracts. Jonathan spread the dense legal agreements across his desk and outlined the specific tactical advantage we had just purchased. The Chicago investors had inserted a standard but aggressive default clause into the founding corporate charter. It stipulated that if the company failed to meet its fiscal obligations, or if the primary investors withdrew their backing due to proven criminal negligence, the primary creditor possessed the unilateral right to seize a controlling interest in the board of directors. The forged $1 million mortgage and the subsequent federal freeze easily triggered the criminal negligence parameter. Jonathan drafted the official notice of default and filed it with the State Commerce Commission. He bypassed the standard 30-day grace period by citing the ongoing federal fraud investigation triggering an emergency hostile takeover. I legally stripped Megan of her voting rights, her executive authority, and her operational control before she even finished her morning coffee. I held the sole power to dictate the future of the company she had spent 3 years building with stolen capital. Jonathan did not give her time to secure emergency legal counsel or file an injunction to halt the process. He immediately drafted a mandatory summons for an emergency corporate board meeting, setting the commencement time for exactly 2 hours later. He emailed the secure video conferencing link directly to Megan's personal inbox. The notification bypassed her frozen corporate servers, ensuring she would receive the digital execution warrant directly on her mobile device. The corporate trap was locked, loaded, and entirely unavoidable. Megan was sitting in a cramped, windowless conference room inside a discount strip mall law firm when the notification arrived on her phone. She had spent the entire morning begging a low-tier defense attorney to take her case on contingency, utterly failing to comprehend the magnitude of the financial freeze. She saw the calendar alert for the emergency board meeting and scrambled to open her laptop. She believed the Chicago investors were calling the meeting to formally sever ties, hoping she could use the opportunity to beg for a debt restructuring plan. She connected to the secure video feed with a desperate practice smile, fully prepared to deploy her standard corporate charm. The digital connection stabilized. Her smile vanished instantly. She did not see the polished, impatient faces of the Chicago private equity syndicate. She saw me. I sat squarely at the head of her custom-built mahogany boardroom table in downtown Atlanta. Jonathan stood silently at my right shoulder, holding a stack of execution documents. I looked directly into the camera lens. I did not offer a greeting. I did not gloat or raise my voice to match the sheer panic blooming across her face. I simply informed her that the original investors had completely abandoned her sinking ship. I told her I had personally purchased every single dollar of her corporate debt, and I was now exercising my absolute legal right as the primary creditor and majority shareholder. Megan tried to speak, stammering about illegal takeovers and threatening to call the authorities. I muted her microphone with a single keystroke. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. I looked at her terrified, silent face on the monitor and officially initiated the corporate liquidation protocol, legally dissolving her company. I unmuted the connection precisely as Megan began sobbing in sheer, unadulterated panic. She begged me to reconsider, claiming she had devoted her entire life to developing the proprietary software. She offered to hand over all projected profits, promising to work for me indefinitely if I just allowed the corporate entity to survive. I ignored her pathetic negotiations entirely. I looked down at the agenda and systematically executed the final phase of her destruction. I formally terminated her position as Chief Executive Officer, stripping away her final shred of corporate identity. I then legally fired her entire bloated executive team, without severance, nullifying their contracts effective immediately. Megan shrieked, slamming her hands against her desk, demanding to know how she was supposed to repay the $300,000 debt if I dissolved the company's operational capacity. Jonathan leaned into the camera frame and provided the devastating answer. He informed her that the debt would be settled through asset forfeiture. I invoked the primary creditor lien to seize absolute ownership of all her intellectual property, her pending patents, and the exclusive rights to her proprietary software architecture. The code she had spent years developing with stolen money now legally belonged to my heavy machinery company. We would sell the digital assets for parts to cover the financial deficit, effectively erasing her technological footprint from the industry. Megan sat paralyzed in her discount lawyer's office, her mouth hanging open in absolute shock. The entire corporate empire she had ruthlessly murdered and forged to build was completely dismantled. She had lost her company, her patents, her executive status, and her life's work in under 10 minutes. I reached forward and terminated the video connection, plunging her screen into total darkness. The darkened computer screen was not the end of Megan's desperate ambition. Stripped of her company and facing impending federal charges, she weaponized her victimhood. She understood that public opinion could be manipulated far easier than a federal judge. Less than 48 hours after the corporate liquidation, Megan marched into the lobby of a prominent local news station. She targeted a specific ratings-driven anchor known for sensationalizing family drama over factual journalism. Megan liquidated the last hidden reserve of cash from a forgotten personal account to guarantee premium airtime. She sat under the bright studio lights wearing a modest, unbranded dress completely devoid of her usual luxury accessories. She manufactured tears with terrifying authenticity. She painted me as an abusive, tyrannical patriarch obsessed with absolute control over his family. She told the camera that my wife's medical condition had driven me into a paranoid frenzy, causing me to lash out and systematically destroy my son's life. She claimed the hostile corporate takeover was a malicious act of vengeance by an unhinged father, punishing a successful daughter-in-law. She completely omitted the forged $1 million mortgage and the lethal insulin sabotage. She spun a tragic tale of a young, terrified couple fighting against a wealthy, vindictive tyrant who used his massive industrial capital to crush anyone who defied his authority. The reporter did not verify a single claim. He did not request comment from Jonathan or check the federal court docket for the underlying fraud lawsuits. He simply nodded sympathetically, allowing Megan to broadcast her fabricated trauma to hundreds of thousands of local viewers. She sought to turn the community into a shield, hoping public outrage would force the authorities to drop the criminal investigations. She gambled everything on a massive, highly publicized lie. The broadcast aired during the prime evening slot, and the resulting backlash was immediate and suffocating. The fabricated narrative of the cruel, wealthy patriarch resonated perfectly with the community's appetite for scandal. By the following morning, the atmosphere in my own town had shifted violently against me. I walked into the local grocery store to purchase basic provisions and felt the heavy weight of hostile stares. Neighbors I had known for decades suddenly turned their backs as I approached the checkout counter. Faint, venomous whispers echoed down the produce aisles, condemning my supposed cruelty toward my grieving son and his innocent wife. The cashier, a young woman whose father had worked at my heavy machinery plant, refused to meet my eyes as she handed me my receipt. The public had swallowed Megan's tearful performance without a single ounce of skepticism. I sat in Jonathan's office later that afternoon watching a recording of Megan's second television appearance. She was emboldened by the immediate surge of public sympathy, doubling down on her vicious rhetoric. I asked Jonathan if we should file an immediate defamation lawsuit to halt the media circus. Jonathan steepled his fingers and shook his head, his eyes locked on the screen with cold amusement. He strictly instructed me to endure the whispers and remain absolutely silent. He explained that Megan was currently intoxicated by her own perceived cleverness. Every word she spoke on live television established a permanent public record of aggressive, calculated deceit. She was not building a defense. She was meticulously constructing the scaffolding for her own execution. Jonathan wanted her to push the lie as far as possible, ensuring that the eventual impact of the truth would be utterly devastating. We allowed her to hold the spotlight, waiting for the perfect moment to drop the guillotine. Megan's media triumph lasted exactly 5 days before Jonathan initiated the counterstrike. He bypassed the local news stations entirely, knowing their journalistic integrity was already compromised. Instead, he packaged the raw, unedited audio files from my concealed transmitter and sent them via a secure digital courier to the lead investigative desk of a massive rival national news network. He provided them with the verified federal court dockets, the forged mortgage documents, and the irrefutable proof of the ongoing criminal investigation. The national network verified the authenticity of the audio within 12 hours. They interrupted their standard evening programming for an exclusive breaking news bulletin. The anchor did not mince words. He introduced the segment as a horrifying exposure of extreme family financial abuse and attempted homicide. The network played the isolated audio recording of Megan and Aaron arguing in the hospital cafeteria. Her shrill, arrogant voice echoed across millions of living rooms nationwide. The broadcast clearly captured her boasting about the lethal medical sabotage. The entire country heard Megan explicitly confess to emptying Sylvia's prescription insulin pen and replacing the life-saving medication with useless saline. They heard her cold, calculating demand to accelerate her mother-in-law's death to secure the insurance payout. They heard Aaron actively panicking over the timeline, entirely complicit in the attempted execution. The audio cut through the fabricated victimhood like a razor blade. There was no room for misinterpretation or clever spin. The raw recording exposed the absolute sociopathic reality of their conspiracy. Jonathan had effectively bypassed the slow grind of the judicial system and delivered the verdict directly to the public. Megan's carefully cultivated image as a persecuted, innocent victim was instantly incinerated on national television. The undeniable truth of her murderous intent was now permanently broadcasted to the entire world. The narrative shift was violently absolute. The local community that had offered Megan their misguided sympathy just hours earlier instantly recoiled in profound horror. The local news anchor who had originally broadcasted her tearful, unverified lies faced an immediate internal investigation. His network executives fired him before the end of the broadcast day to salvage their remaining credibility. The public rage turned entirely against the woman who had manipulated their compassion to mask an attempted murder. Megan transformed from a tragic, wronged daughter-in-law into an international pariah overnight. She could no longer step outside the doors of her rented apartment without facing immediate aggressive confrontation. Citizens recognized her face from the national broadcast and shouted vicious insults across parking lots. Store owners actively refused her service, demanding she leave their establishments. The digital backlash was even more severe, with thousands of voices condemning her cold-blooded willingness to execute a helpless woman for a financial payout. She was utterly trapped by her own notoriety. There was no remaining social capital to exploit, no hidden financial reserves to leverage, and no sympathizers left to manipulate. The intense media scrutiny forced the federal prosecutors to accelerate their timeline. The blinding glare of the national spotlight guaranteed there would be no quiet plea deals or swept-under-the-rug settlements. Megan was entirely isolated, stripped of her corporate empire, abandoned by her husband, and universally despised by the public. She spent her days locked inside a cramped, darkened room, listening to the relentless buzzing of her phone as journalists, former colleagues, and angry citizens hurled demands for accountability. The psychological siege was absolute. She had attempted to use the media as a weapon against me, and Jonathan had flawlessly redirected the blast, ensuring the resulting inferno consumed her entire existence. The suffocating isolation of Megan's public disgrace eventually forced her to seek rescue from the only people left who felt obligated to answer her desperate calls. Her parents, frantic to salvage their daughter's incinerated reputation and keep her out of a federal penitentiary, completely liquidated their life savings. They drained their hard-earned retirement accounts, mortgaged their primary residence, and cashed out their modest investment portfolios. They funneled every single available dollar into retaining a syndicate of elite, high-priced defense attorneys imported directly from Chicago. These were not local public defenders or plea bargain negotiators. They were aggressive surgical litigators who specialized in dismantling federal prosecutions by weaponizing obscure procedural technicalities. The Chicago team arrived in Knoxville with custom-tailored suits and a chillingly pragmatic strategy. They knew they could never dispute the factual reality of Megan's lethal conspiracy. The national broadcast had already permanently cemented her guilt in the court of public opinion. Instead, the defense strategy relied on completely suffocating the physical evidence before the trial even began. They intended to bury the prosecution under a mountain of frivolous paperwork, endless evidentiary objections, and aggressive procedural delays. They planned to exhaust the local district attorney's office and force a dismissal based on manufactured procedural errors. Megan sat in their sterile rented office space, absorbing their ruthless legal doctrine with a renewed sense of arrogant confidence. The elite legal team assured her that the criminal justice system was merely an elaborate game of structural leverage. They promised to find a microscopic flaw in Jonathan's flawless execution and use it to tear the prosecution's entire case to shreds. Megan began to believe that her parents' financial sacrifice had successfully purchased her salvation. She convinced herself that the impending trial would simply be another corporate negotiation she could win through sheer, calculated manipulation. The Chicago defense team launched their first major offensive less than a week before the preliminary hearings commenced. They filed an incredibly aggressive, heavily researched motion to suppress the central pillar of the prosecution's entire case. They specifically targeted the digital audio recording of the hospital cafeteria altercation. The defense attorneys submitted a 50-page brief arguing that the hidden wiretap explicitly violated state and federal two-party consent statutes. They built a highly sophisticated, entirely fabricated narrative surrounding the physical location of the recording. The motion argued that the hospital cafeteria at that specific hour functioned as a secluded private space. They claimed Megan and Aaron were engaged in an intimate, highly sensitive family medical discussion and therefore possessed a legally protected, reasonable expectation of privacy. The defense attorneys painted my covert recording device as a malicious, illegal invasion of their civil rights. They demanded the judge completely strike the audio file from the official court record. If the suppression motion succeeded, the prosecution would instantly lose the explicit, undeniable confession of the insulin sabotage. Without the tape, the state would be forced to rely on circumstantial evidence and hearsay to prove the attempted murder charge. Megan sat behind the heavy oak defense table during the suppression, hearing her posture radiating a cold, renewed arrogance. She truly believed her expensive Chicago lawyers had outmaneuvered Jonathan. She watched her lead attorney passionately argue that allowing the audio into evidence would constitute a catastrophic violation of due process. The lawyer dramatically gestured toward the courtroom ceiling, insisting that validating an illegal wiretap would set a terrifying legal precedent for the entire judicial district. Megan allowed a faint, triumphant smirk to touch the corners of her mouth. She was entirely convinced she was about to watch the prosecution's lethal weapon evaporate into thin air. Jonathan did not flinch as the defense concluded their passionate, entirely fabricated argument. He calmly stood up from the prosecution table, buttoned his suit jacket, and approached the center of the courtroom. He did not waste a single breath addressing the defense attorney's theatrical outrage. He addressed the judge with absolute mechanical precision. Jonathan formally entered a new, devastating exhibit into the federal docket. He handed the bailiff a thick, certified stack of internal hospital security logs, architectural blueprints, and employee shift schedules. He systematically dismantled the Chicago team's entire legal foundation within 3 minutes. Jonathan presented undeniable time-stamped evidence proving the hospital cafeteria was actively operating as a high-traffic public thoroughfare at the exact moment of the recording. He pointed to the structural blueprints noting the absence of doors, physical barriers, or restricted access signs around our specific seating area. He read aloud from the security logs demonstrating that dozens of doctors, nurses, and civilian visitors had walked within 5 feet of our table during the altercation. He entered sworn affidavits from the hospital administration confirming the cafeteria is legally classified as an unrestricted public forum 24 hours a day. Jonathan looked directly at the judge and stated the immutable legal reality. Because the confrontation occurred in a wide-open, heavily trafficked public space, neither Megan nor Aaron possessed any fundamental legal right to an expectation of privacy. Therefore, the two-party consent wiretapping statutes were completely null and void. Anyone sitting at the adjacent tables could have overheard their murderous conspiracy. Jonathan concluded his counterstrike by sliding a federal appellate court precedent across the bench. The precedent explicitly established that loud, aggressive conversations conducted in public hospital cafeterias forfeit all privacy protections. Jonathan turned and walked back to his seat, leaving the defense team's entire argument shattered on the courtroom floor. The presiding judge picked up Jonathan's submitted documentation. The entire courtroom descended into a suffocating, breathless silence. The judge meticulously reviewed the hospital security logs and the architectural blueprints. He cross-referenced Jonathan's federal appellate precedent with his own thick, leather-bound legal volumes. The process took precisely 10 minutes, but the tension in the room stretched the silence into an eternity. Megan's arrogant smirk slowly evaporated, replaced by a rigid, trembling anxiety. She watched her expensive Chicago attorneys urgently whispering to one another, their previous predatory confidence completely dissolving into visible panic. The judge finally closed the precedent file and looked down at the defense table. His face was carved from granite. He addressed the Chicago litigators with a tone of absolute dismissive finality. He stated that their attempt to classify a bustling, unrestricted hospital cafeteria as a secluded private sanctuary was legally baseless and factually absurd. He noted that yelling a murder confession in a public thoroughfare permanently eradicates any constitutional claim to privacy. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down against the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. He officially ruled the digital audio recording fully admissible and completely exempt from any further suppression efforts. The pristine wiretap containing Megan's explicit, remorseless confession to the insulin sabotage would be played in its entirety before the trial jury. The lead defense attorney slumped back into his leather chair, the color draining entirely from his face. He knew his expensive legal strategy had just been completely incinerated. Megan stared blankly at the judge's bench, her chest heaving as the crushing weight of reality finally broke through her sociopathic delusions. The expensive lawyers, the drained retirement accounts, and the clever technicalities had all failed. She realized with absolute certainty that she was going to lose. Aaron sat on the edge of the bolted steel cot. The heavy iron door of his isolated federal holding cell offered a grim, unyielding finality. The adrenaline that had fueled his frantic parking lot confrontation and his subsequent arrest had completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, suffocating terror. He was entirely isolated from the luxury estate, the tailored suits, and the corporate prestige he had built upon a foundation of fraud. The pristine digital audio recording of his own violent cafeteria outburst played on a continuous loop in his mind. The judge's absolute refusal to suppress the wiretap meant the prosecution possessed irrefutable proof of his complicity in a lethal conspiracy. His high-priced defense attorney had visited him precisely once, delivering a blunt, unapologetic assessment of his legal reality. The state was preparing to charge him with attempted murder, felony forgery, and massive financial fraud. The mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines dictated a minimum of 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary. Aaron stared at the cinder block wall as the sheer magnitude of that number crushed the last remnants of his arrogance. 20 years meant his life was effectively over. He would lose his youth, his freedom, and whatever hollow status he still craved. He realized with absolute clarity that his wife had already tried to sell him to the prosecution to save her own skin. Megan had left her encrypted laptop open, broadcasting her willingness to completely sacrifice him in exchange for civil immunity. Aaron possessed absolutely no loyalty left to give. He requested his single allotted phone call and bypassed his own expensive legal counsel entirely. He dialed the direct office line of the lead district attorney. He clutched the heavy plastic receiver to his ear and begged for an immediate confidential proffer session to negotiate his total unconditional surrender. The lead prosecutor arranged the proffer session in a sterile interrogation room deep within the federal courthouse. Aaron sat shackled to a heavy metal table, sweating heavily through his issued uniform. The district attorney did not offer him a beverage or a sympathetic ear. She laid out a sprawling, meticulously documented timeline of the entire conspiracy. The state had already traced the forged $1 million mortgage and the subsequent liquidations. They held all the leverage, but the prosecutor recognized the tactical difficulty of proving exactly who physically swapped the insulin for saline. Megan's elite Chicago defense team was preparing to bury the court in reasonable doubt. The district attorney presented a stark, non-negotiable ultimatum. She offered to reduce Aaron's charges from attempted murder to accessory after the fact, capping his potential prison sentence at 5 years. In exchange, he had to provide sworn, unshakable testimony that Megan was the absolute mastermind behind the medical sabotage. He needed to state on the official federal record that his wife explicitly engineered the plot to accelerate Sylvia's death to secure the insurance capital. Aaron did not hesitate to accept the terms. He did not ask for a moment to consult his conscience or reflect on his marriage vows. He signed the formal cooperation agreement with a trembling hand, binding his fate entirely to the prosecution. He agreed to detail every single conversation, every logistical step, and every malicious intent Megan had harbored. He traded the woman he had promised to love and protect for a fraction of his freedom. The prosecutor gathered the signed documents and left the interrogation room without shaking his hand. Aaron remained chained to the desk, a fully compliant weapon now aimed directly at the woman who had helped him orchestrate his own mother's execution. Aaron took the witness stand wearing an ill-fitting gray suit provided by the state. He raised his right hand and swore the federal oath under the intense, blinding glare of the courtroom lights. Megan sat at the defense table, her posture rigid, her eyes burning with absolute concentrated hatred. Aaron avoided looking at her directly as the prosecutor initiated the direct examination. He spoke into the microphone with a carefully measured tone, detailing the catastrophic financial reality that had driven them to conspiracy. He admitted to the court that he had accumulated massive hidden gambling debts, hemorrhaging hundreds of thousands of dollars through offshore sports betting syndicates. He explained that the creditors had begun issuing severe physical threats, pushing him to the absolute brink of total ruin. Then he delivered the lethal blow. Aaron testified that Megan discovered his financial collapse and immediately took control of the situation. He told the jury that she viewed his dying mother not as a tragedy, but as an untapped liquid asset. He described the exact moment in their master bedroom when Megan proposed emptying the life-saving insulin pen and replacing the fluid with sterile saline. He testified that she meticulously researched the degradation of the medication and calculated the precise timeline of the induced diabetic coma. He stated under oath that she physically executed the swap while visiting the intensive care unit, manipulating the medical equipment while he stood watch by the door. His testimony was brutal, surgical, and deeply incriminating. He painted a chilling portrait of a cold, calculating woman willing to commit first-degree murder to protect her lavish lifestyle and resolve his massive financial liabilities. The jury listened in absolute horrified silence as a husband meticulously dismantled his own wife's entire criminal defense. The lead defense attorney from Chicago approached the witness stand with the predatory grace of a starving wolf. He did not immediately challenge the factual timeline of the insulin swap. Instead, he launched a devastating, highly coordinated attack directly on Aaron's fundamental credibility. The lawyer produced a towering stack of financial ledgers and offshore betting receipts, dropping them onto the wooden podium with a deafening thud. He relentlessly hammered Aaron about his severe gambling addiction, forcing him to admit that he had lied to his family, his employers, and his own wife for nearly a decade. The attorney painted Aaron as a desperate, pathological liar backed into a corner by incredibly dangerous loan sharks. He asked Aaron to confirm that his cooperation agreement reduced his potential prison sentence by over 15 years. When Aaron quietly acknowledged the plea deal, the lawyer turned toward the jury with a triumphant sneer. He loudly suggested that a man willing to forge $1 million mortgage to cover his illicit gambling debts would effortlessly commit perjury to save his life. The cross-examination was a masterclass in total character assassination. The defense attorney systematically exposed Aaron's bottomless greed, his history of cowardice, and his undeniable motive to frame his wife to escape the harshest federal penalties. He forced Aaron to contradict his own timeline, highlighting minor discrepancies in his memory regarding the hospital visit. By the time the lawyer returned to the defense table, Aaron sat slumped in the witness chair, his reliability entirely shredded. The jury watched him with visible disgust, openly questioning every word he had spoken. The prosecution's star witness had been neutralized. The heavy, suffocating tension in the courtroom signaled that the definitive outcome of the trial now hung precariously in the balance. I sat in the hard wooden gallery bench watching the Chicago defense attorney systematically dismantle the prosecution's case. Aaron had proven to be a fundamentally flawed weapon. His history of gambling and deceit provided the exact leverage Megan's lawyers needed to introduce reasonable doubt into the minds of the jury. The courtroom air felt thick, oppressive, and heavily tilted in favor of the woman who had orchestrated my family's ruin. Jonathan sat rigidly beside the lead prosecutor, his usual unshakable confidence replaced by a grim, calculating silence. We were losing the narrative. The defense attorney paced before the jury box, loudly summarizing Aaron's extensive perjuries, preparing to demand an immediate dismissal of the attempted murder charges. In that suffocating moment of impending defeat, a sharp, sustained vibration broke my focus. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my mobile phone. The caller ID displayed the primary secure line for the intensive care unit. It was Dr. Aris, the chief neurologist, overseeing my wife's comatose state. I stood up immediately, ignoring the sharp glare of the bailiff, and pushed my way through the heavy swinging doors at the rear of the courtroom. I answered the call the second I crossed the threshold into the marble hallway. Dr. Aris did not waste time with medical pleasantries or buffered expectations. His voice was breathless, carrying an urgency I had not heard in months. He informed me that Sylvia's neurological monitors had just recorded a massive sustained spike in cerebral activity. Her vital signs were rapidly stabilizing without the assistance of life support machines. The induced coma had broken. He told me to get to the hospital immediately. My wife had just opened her eyes. I did not return to the courtroom to inform Jonathan. I sprinted down the courthouse steps, leaving the crumbling legal battle entirely behind me. The judicial theater no longer mattered. I navigated the congested downtown traffic with a singular, blinding focus, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The sprawling hospital complex loomed ahead, a concrete fortress where my wife had remained a silent prisoner for far too long. I abandoned my vehicle in the emergency drop-off zone and bypassed the administrative desks, moving through the sterile corridors with absolute authority. I pushed through the double doors of the intensive care unit and found a team of nurses frantically adjusting the medical monitors surrounding bed number 4. Dr. Aris stood at the foot of the mattress, reviewing a printed readout of her brainwave activity. He stepped aside as I approached. Sylvia lay against the stark white pillows, no longer tethered to the rhythmic, artificial hiss of the mechanical ventilator. She looked incredibly fragile, her skin pale, and her frame diminished by the prolonged immobility. Yet as I stepped into her line of sight, her gaze locked onto mine. There was no vacant stare, no lingering neurological fog clouding her vision. Her eyes were sharp, carrying the undeniable weight of profound recognition. I leaned over the metal railing and took her hand. Her fingers were weak, trembling slightly against my palm, but she squeezed my hand with a deliberate, conscious pressure. She managed a faint, exhausted smile, her dry lips parting to whisper my name. The oppressive, terrifying silence that had suffocated our lives for months was finally shattered. My wife had fought her way back from the absolute brink of death, and she knew exactly who I was. The subsequent 48 hours transformed the entire trajectory of our reality. Sylvia's cognitive recovery outpaced every conservative medical projection Dr. Aris had established. The initial disorientation faded rapidly, replaced by a crystalline clarity that stunned the neurological team. As her physical strength slowly returned, the fragmented pieces of her short-term memory began to seamlessly align. We sat together in the quiet sanctuary of her private recovery suite as she meticulously reconstructed the final hours before her collapse. I did not prompt her or offer any details of the ongoing federal trial. I simply listened as she recounted the events with terrifying precision. Sylvia clearly remembered standing in our kitchen preparing to administer her scheduled dose of insulin. She recalled Megan entering the room offering to help with a sudden, uncharacteristic sweetness. My wife described the exact sequence of events. She remembered turning her back to reach for a glass of water, leaving her medical supplies on the granite counter. She caught a reflection in the dark glass of the microwave oven. She clearly saw Megan swiftly exchange the customized glass vial inside the injection pen, slipping the original medication into her pocket and replacing it with a visually identical counterfeit tube. Sylvia remembered questioning the action, feeling a sudden wave of dizziness as the counterfeit liquid entered her bloodstream. She remembered Megan standing over her as she collapsed onto the hardwood floor, watching her with a cold, detached fascination instead of calling for emergency services. The devastating puzzle was finally complete. We did not need Aaron's compromised testimony or the highly contested wiretap audio to secure a conviction. The prosecution now possessed the ultimate unassailable weapon. The victim had survived the execution, and she possessed a perfect memory of her attempted murderer. I contacted Jonathan immediately after Sylvia finished recounting the sabotage. He comprehended the monumental shift in our leverage instantly. He contacted the lead prosecutor and arranged for a covert, highly secured deposition directly inside the hospital wing. They arrived at the intensive care recovery unit accompanied by a certified court stenographer and a federal videographer. The prosecution team recognized that Megan's Chicago defense attorneys were currently celebrating their perceived victory, entirely unaware that their entire legal strategy was about to be annihilated. The videographer established a focused camera angle at the foot of Sylvia's hospital bed, ensuring the lighting captured her lucid, determined expression. The prosecutor approached with a gentle but professional demeanor, initiating the formal sworn testimony. Sylvia raised her right hand and swore the oath without a single tremor of hesitation. She looked directly into the camera lens and systematically destroyed Megan's fabricated narrative. She detailed the kitchen encounter, the visual confirmation of the vial swap, and the chilling apathy her daughter-in-law displayed as she lost consciousness. Her voice was weak from the prolonged intubation, but her delivery was absolute, unwavering, and devastatingly clear. The prosecutor asked specific, meticulously crafted questions to eliminate any potential avenues for cross-examination regarding medical delirium or memory degradation. Sylvia answered each inquiry flawlessly, demonstrating a perfect command of her faculties. The stenographer's fingers flew across the keys, transcribing the definitive record of a first-degree attempted murder. Jonathan stood by the door, his eyes locked on the digital recording monitor with grim satisfaction. The defense's attempt to crush the wiretap and destroy Aaron's credibility no longer held any tactical value. Megan had built her defense on the assumption that her primary victim would never speak again. Sylvia's videotaped testimony was an inescapable death sentence for Megan's freedom. The trial abruptly resumed the following morning, with the Chicago defense team launching a desperate, heavily choreographed counteroffensive. They could not suppress Sylvia's videotaped deposition, so they chose to aggressively dismantle her cognitive reliability. The lead defense attorney paced before the jury box, his voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. He acknowledged the profound tragedy of Sylvia's medical crisis, but immediately pivoted to attack the authenticity of her newly restored memory. He paraded two highly paid, aggressive neurological experts to the witness stand. These hired specialists testified at length about the devastating impact of prolonged anoxia on the human brain, citing numerous complex medical studies detailing the phenomenon of coma-induced retrograde amnesia. The defense attorney wove these clinical testimonies into a sinister accusation. He aggressively argued that Sylvia's vivid recollection of the kitchen encounter was entirely a product of subconscious suggestion. He pointed a rigid finger directly at me, accusing me of intentionally implanting a false memory into my wife's fragile, recovering mind during our private hours in the intensive care unit. He claimed I was using her vulnerability to secure my own personal vendetta against a successful, independent daughter-in-law. The jury watched the defense meticulously plant the seeds of reasonable doubt. The lawyer argued that a woman emerging from a near-death state, heavily medicated and neurologically traumatized, could not possibly differentiate between objective reality and the vengeful narrative her husband repeatedly whispered into her ear. Megan sat at the defense table, her posture radiating a calculated, tragic innocence. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue, perfectly playing the role of a falsely accused woman fighting against an overwhelmingly powerful, manipulative patriarch. The courtroom air grew thick with renewed uncertainty as the defense successfully shifted the focus from Megan's lethal actions to Sylvia's severely compromised and highly unstable neurological state. I sat rigidly in the gallery, listening to the Chicago lawyer completely assassinate my wife's credibility. The sheer audacity of the defense strategy was infuriating yet undeniably effective. The jury was leaning forward, visibly absorbing the clinical doubt the experts had aggressively poured into the room. I stared at Megan's perfectly composed face, sickened by her ability to weaponize my wife's severe medical trauma. I cast my mind backward, meticulously reviewing every single second of the afternoon Sylvia had collapsed. I retraced my frantic drive to the estate, the wail of the approaching ambulance, and the chaotic scene on the manicured street. The memory of the flashing red emergency lights illuminated a singular, overlooked detail. I remembered Mr. Gallagher, Our hostile elderly neighbor, the decorated retired military veteran who had decisively ended Aaron's armed standoff by throwing a landscaping brick through the front window, possessed a notorious obsession with absolute neighborhood security. I vividly recalled the distinct placement of his expensive high-definition perimeter cameras mounted along his roofline. His primary camera did not just monitor his immaculate lawn. The wide-angle lens pointed directly down the street, capturing the main intersection and the entrance to the corner pharmacy, located precisely 3 blocks from our gated community. Megan had claimed she spent that entire afternoon completely isolated inside her home office, completely unaware of Sylvia's deteriorating condition until the ambulance arrived. I leaned over the wooden railing and grabbed Jonathan's shoulder, pulling him away from the prosecution table. I whispered the realization directly into his ear, outlining the exact geographical trajectory between Mr. Gallagher's front porch and the local pharmacy. Jonathan's eyes widened instantly as he comprehended the immense tactical magnitude of the security setup. We possessed a definitive, untampered digital witness that could permanently shatter the Chicago defense's carefully constructed timeline. Jonathan did not wait for a scheduled judicial recess. He immediately dispatched his fastest junior associate from the courtroom with a drafted emergency subpoena. The target was Mr. Gallagher's centralized security server and the internal transaction records of the corner pharmacy. The defense team continued their lengthy presentation, entirely oblivious to the lethal digital snare closing tightly around their client. The junior associate returned 3 hours later, entering the courtroom through the heavy oak doors, carrying a sealed, encrypted hard drive. Jonathan connected the drive to the prosecution's secure laptop and rapidly reviewed the raw, time-stamped video files alongside the lead prosecutor. The digital harvest was absolutely undeniably devastating. Mr. Gallagher's high-definition camera had captured Megan's distinctive silver luxury sedan, pulling out of our driveway exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes before Sylvia suffered her massive diabetic collapse. The footage flawlessly tracked her vehicle driving down the residential street and parking directly in front of the corner pharmacy. Jonathan cross-referenced the neighborhood video with the internal security feeds successfully subpoenaed from the pharmacy manager. The store's overhead cameras provided a pristine, undeniable view of Megan walking swiftly down the medical supply aisle. She bypassed the standard over-the-counter painkillers and walked directly toward the specialized diabetic care section. The overhead lens captured her meticulously examining several different boxes before selecting a specific package of medical-grade sterile saline solution. The timestamps across both distinct video feeds aligned with absolute irrefutable precision, completely destroying her sworn alibi. She had not been working isolated in her home office. She had been actively hunting for the exact chemical component required to execute her mother-in-law. Jonathan closed the laptop, a grim, triumphant smile finally breaking across his face. We now possessed the unshakable empirical proof required to lock Megan inside a federal penitentiary for decades. The lead prosecutor requested an immediate emergency sidebar with the presiding judge. He formally submitted the newly acquired video evidence into the permanent trial record, overriding the defense team's frantic shouting objections. The judge ordered the courtroom lights dimmed and directed all attention to the massive digital monitor mounted directly across from the jury box. Megan's elite Chicago attorneys sat paralyzed as the crystal-clear footage from the pharmacy's overhead camera illuminated the silent room. The entire shocked jury watched Megan walk up to the pharmacy checkout counter holding the box of medical-grade saline. The video flawlessly captured her refusing to use a traceable credit card. She opened her expensive designer purse, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, and handed the cash directly to the cashier. The high-definition lens then recorded the most damning premeditated action of her entire criminal conspiracy. Megan did not place the saline inside a standard plastic shopping bag. She swiftly removed the glass vial from its cardboard packaging, discarded the box into a nearby waste bin to eliminate the evidence, and discreetly slipped the raw saline vial deep inside her purse. She then smiled politely at the cashier and walked out the glass doors, driving straight back to our estate to execute her mother-in-law. The profound silence in the courtroom was absolute and completely suffocating. The irrefutable visual proof of her carefully calculated, cold-blooded methodology obliterated the defense's clinical arguments regarding false memories and false accusations. Sylvia's detailed testimony was definitively corroborated by indisputable empirical fact. Megan stared at her own giant illuminated face on the screen, her chest heaving as the last shred of her arrogant delusion shattered. The lead defense attorney slowly reached out, snapped his heavy leather briefcase shut, and looked away from his client. They now had absolutely nothing left to argue. The 12 members of the jury stood in unison and filed out of the courtroom, their faces locked in grim, unreadable expressions. The heavy oak door sealed behind them with a resounding click, plunging the gallery into a suffocating, unbearable tension. The trial phase was officially over. The digital footage of the pharmacy transaction had dismantled the final desperate illusion of Megan's innocence. Her elite Chicago defense attorneys immediately began frantically packing their leather briefcases, quietly discussing plea bargains and mitigation strategies they could no longer deploy. They completely ignored their client. Megan sat rigidly at the defense table, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging deep into the polished wood. She looked around the cavernous room, her eyes darting toward the exits like a trapped animal calculating its final desperate maneuver. She understood with absolute chilling clarity that the jury would not require a lengthy deliberation. The visual evidence was an airtight execution warrant. She waited until Jonathan and the lead prosecutor engaged in a hushed conversation near the judge's bench. Megan slowly stood up, smoothing the front of her modest dress, and leaned toward the bailiff stationed near the defense table. She quietly requested permission to use the private restroom located just down the adjacent corridor, citing severe nausea. The bailiff, accustomed to the physical toll of impending convictions, nodded and gestured toward the side door. Megan did not walk toward the designated restroom. The second the heavy courtroom door swung shut behind her, she abandoned her fabricated composure. She sprinted silently down the polished marble hallway, completely bypassing the primary public security checkpoints. She pushed through the heavy metal fire doors leading directly to the emergency stairwell, her heels echoing sharply against the concrete. She was executing a meticulously planned contingency strategy, leaving her ruined corporate empire entirely behind forever. Megan burst through the ground-level exit of the courthouse building, the bright midday sun momentarily blinding her. She did not hesitate or look over her shoulder to see if the bailiff had noticed her prolonged absence. She immediately flagged down a waiting yellow taxi idling near the pedestrian crosswalk. She yanked the rear door open, threw herself onto the worn leather seat, and slapped a crisp $100 bill against the plastic partition. She ordered the driver to take the fastest, most direct route to the regional airport, demanding he ignore the posted speed limits. Megan had prepared for this exact catastrophic failure. Months before her initial corporate fraud had been completely exposed, she had secretly secured a secondary passport, using her maiden name and a fabricated residential address in a neighboring state. She had quietly liquidated a forgotten offshore account, transferring the illicit funds into an untraceable digital wallet to finance her permanent disappearance. The taxi tore down the interstate, violently weaving through the heavy afternoon traffic. Megan stared out the tinted window, her mind racing with calculated precision. She had already booked a first-class one-way ticket to Paris on a massive international flight scheduled to depart within the hour. The European destination offered her a sprawling, chaotic metropolis where she could easily vanish and reinvent her identity using her stolen capital. The vehicle aggressively swerved into the crowded airport departure lane, grinding to a halt before the terminal doors. Megan abandoned the yellow taxi, sprinting directly toward the international security gates. She gripped her fraudulent passport tightly in her right hand, navigating the dense crowds of travelers with a desperate, frantic energy. She watched the bright, flashing digital departure board overhead, entirely convinced she had finally and successfully outsmarted the federal prosecutors and definitively secured her own ultimate untouchable freedom. Megan reached the designated international departure gate, her heart hammering violently against her ribcage. The massive commercial airliner sat waiting on the tarmac, the final bridge between her impending federal imprisonment and a life of luxurious anonymity. She handed her fraudulent passport and her first-class boarding pass to the airline attendant stationed at the desk. She offered a strained, polite smile, fully expecting to walk down the jet bridge. The attendant scanned the barcode, but the digital kiosk immediately flashed a severe red warning light. The machine locked her transaction. Megan demanded to know the problem, her voice rising in sudden panic. Before the attendant could formulate an answer, the heavy glass doors adjacent to the boarding area swung open. 4 armed federal marshals marched directly onto the concourse, their badges gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Jonathan had anticipated her flight risk weeks ago, quietly placing her biological and assumed identities on an extreme, strictly monitored international no-fly registry. The lead marshal approached Megan, commanding her to step away from the boarding desk. She froze, the color draining entirely from her face as the illusion of her escape collapsed. She turned to run, but two heavily armored officers intercepted her instantly. They grabbed her arms, forcing her wrists firmly behind her back. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly across the crowded terminal. Hundreds of waiting passengers turned their attention toward the violent commotion. Dozens of smartphones were immediately raised into the air, their camera lenses perfectly capturing her absolute, humiliating defeat. The marshals dragged her away from the gate, ignoring her frantic, hysterical screams. She thrashed against their iron grip, losing a high-heeled shoe on the polished tile. Her carefully constructed criminal empire had officially ended in a very public, utterly devastating, and completely irreversible arrest. Megan was roughly dragged back into the federal courthouse building just 4 hours after orchestrating her pathetic escape. The marshals marched her directly through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, her wrists still securely locked in heavy steel cuffs. She no longer possessed the polished, untouchable aura of a brilliant corporate entrepreneur. Her clothing was severely disheveled, her makeup was smeared across her cheeks, and she was missing a shoe. Her elite Chicago criminal defense attorneys refused to look at her, packing away their files in stony, defeated silence. I sat in the front gallery row next to Jonathan, watching her forced march with absolute, detached satisfaction. The bailiff directed her into the defendant's chair precisely as the rear doors opened. The 12 members of the jury filed back into the room, moving with a synchronized, heavy finality. They took their designated seats and refused to cast a single glance in Megan's direction. The presiding judge struck his heavy wooden gavel, demanding total silence across the packed gallery. He instructed the jury foreman to stand and read the finalized verdict for the official court record. The foreman unfolded a single sheet of paper, his voice cutting clearly through the suffocating tension. He declared Megan formally guilty of massive wire fraud. He declared her guilty of conspiracy to commit severe financial extortion. The foreman paused for a fraction of a second before delivering the ultimate lethal blow. He declared her guilty of first-degree attempted murder. Megan collapsed forward, sobbing uncontrollably against the polished wood of the defense table. The gavel slammed down again, officially cementing her destruction. The fraudulent empire she had violently assembled was completely eradicated. My family was finally secure, and the vicious monster who had almost executed my wife was securely locked away in federal prison forever. The sentencing phase of the trial commenced exactly 48 hours after the jury delivered its devastating verdict. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity, a silent gallery waiting for the final, definitive conclusion to a conspiracy born of unadulterated greed. Aaron and Megan sat at their respective defense tables, separated by a heavy wooden partition and a chasm of absolute betrayal. Their expensive lawyers had exhausted every possible procedural maneuver. There were no further motions to suppress, no frantic appeals, and no remaining technicalities to exploit. They were completely at the mercy of the federal court. The presiding judge adjusted his heavy robes and addressed the defendants directly. He did not mask his profound disgust. He stated for the official record that he had presided over countless cases of financial fraud and violent crime throughout his lengthy judicial career. Yet he noted that the sheer, calculated cruelty of their conspiracy was entirely unprecedented. He dismantled their fabricated victimhood, describing their actions as a parasitic exploitation of family loyalty. The judge highlighted the specific horror of an adult son actively participating in the slow, premeditated execution of the mother who had raised him simply to extinguish a massive gambling debt. He noted that Megan's attempt to manipulate a life-saving medical device demonstrated a level of sociopathic detachment that absolutely required the harshest possible penalty. The judge lifted his heavy wooden gavel and delivered the final inescapable ruin. He sentenced both Aaron and Megan to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He explicitly invoked a specialized sentencing parameter, mandating that neither defendant would be eligible for early release or probationary parole. The sharp, decisive crack of the gavel echoed through the silent room, officially closing the book on their fraudulent empire. They were handcuffed immediately and escorted out of the courtroom by federal marshals, leaving behind a legacy of complete devastation. The immediate aftermath of the federal sentencing triggered the absolute financial collapse of Aaron's fabricated lifestyle. The federal court order mandated complete asset forfeiture to satisfy the massive debts they had accumulated through offshore syndicates and fraudulent corporate loans. I stood on the manicured sidewalk outside their sprawling Knoxville estate, watching the final dissolution of their fraudulent empire. The primary lending bank had formally finalized the foreclosure process the previous evening, completely voiding their claim to the million-dollar property. The massive oak front doors stood wide open, guarded by armed county sheriffs overseeing the repossession. A convoy of heavy commercial moving trucks idled in the long, paved driveway. The moving crews moved with mechanical efficiency, systematically hauling away every symbol of Aaron's stolen success. They carried out the custom leather sofas, the imported marble dining tables, and the massive high-definition televisions. They emptied the master bedroom of its designer clothing and stripped the walls of their expensive curated artwork. The physical manifestation of their arrogance was completely disassembled and packed tightly into the rear of the steel shipping containers. The entire inventory would be sold at a public federal auction, the resulting capital distributed to the desperate private equity investors and the countless creditors Aaron had systematically defrauded. The massive, pristine house was reduced to an empty, echoing concrete shell in under 3 hours. Mr. Gallagher stood on his adjacent porch watching the chaotic liquidation with a grim, satisfied nod. The neighborhood was finally purged of the parasitic threat that had nearly destroyed my family. I turned away from the empty estate without a single shred of regret. The fraudulent monument my son had built to mask his failure was gone. I walked back to my vehicle, ready to completely sever my ties to Knoxville. The conclusion of the legal and financial warfare cleared the path for the only priority that truly mattered. I drove my heavy truck directly from the foreclosed estate to the regional medical center. Dr. Aris had personally signed the official discharge papers that morning, confirming Sylvia's neurological recovery was stabilized and her physical strength was completely restored. I walked into the intensive care unit and found my wife sitting on the edge of her hospital bed dressed in her own clothes. The sterile medical gowns and the suffocating tangle of monitoring wires were gone. She looked exhausted, carrying the visible toll of a profound trauma, but her eyes were sharp, resilient, and entirely clear. We did not discuss the federal sentencing or the liquidation of the Knoxville property. The toxic reality of Aaron and Megan no longer held any power over our existence. I carefully supported Sylvia as she stood, guiding her slowly through the sliding glass doors of the intensive care ward. We bypassed the busy nurses' station and navigated the long, brightly lit corridors toward the primary exit. I helped her up into the high cab of my truck, securing the heavy seatbelt across her chest. I started the powerful diesel engine, the low, familiar rumble vibrating through the chassis. We drove away from the sprawling hospital complex, merging onto the southbound interstate highway. The manicured streets of Knoxville rapidly faded into the rearview mirror. We began the long, quiet journey back to Atlanta. The drive was peaceful, devoid of the frantic, suffocating panic that had consumed me during my initial race to the hospital weeks earlier. We left the wreckage of our son's life completely behind us, abandoning the ruins of his greed to the federal authorities. We were returning home entirely focused on reclaiming the quiet, secure life we had built together. The heavy, humid air of the Atlanta evening settled across the wraparound porch of our home. I sat in my sturdy wooden rocking chair, a hot cup of black coffee resting on the small table beside me. Sylvia sat in the adjacent chair, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching the fiery orange sun slowly dip below the dense tree line. The sprawling headquarters of my heavy machinery business sat just a few miles away, operating with absolute uninterrupted efficiency. My chief financial officer had successfully integrated Megan's seized software architecture into our logistics network, stabilizing our profit margins and solidifying our market dominance. The chaotic legal battles were completely resolved. The federal prosecutors had secured their convictions. The fraudulent debts were absorbed, and the threat to my family was permanently neutralized. The violent, suffocating storm that had consumed our lives for months had finally broken, leaving behind a profound, hard-won tranquility. I looked out over this quiet expanse of our property. I had not sought a war. I had built my life on a foundation of honest labor, quiet discipline, and absolute loyalty to my family. When that foundation was viciously attacked by the very son I had raised, I did not retaliate with mindless rage. I executed a precise, unyielding strategy. I dismantled his fraudulent empire, exposed his lethal conspiracy, and ensured the federal justice system delivered an inescapable consequence. I had protected my wife from a terrifying execution and restored the fundamental security of our home. Sylvia reached across the small table and rested her hand gently over mine. We did not need to speak. The silence stretching across the porch was no longer a symptom of a hidden threat or a suffocating secret. It was the quiet, absolute confirmation of safety. The silent adjustment was complete. A life built on deceit and exploitation inevitably collapses under the weight of its own arrogance. The story illustrates that while manipulative individuals may secure temporary victories through cunning schemes, they systematically underestimate the quiet, enduring strength of their victims. True power does not reside in stolen wealth or fabricated narratives. It lives in the resilient bonds of genuine love and unwavering truth. When pushed to the absolute limit, the most unassuming people can dismantle empires of fraud with surgical precision. Ultimately, true justice is achieved not through mindless vengeance, but through a calculated, silent restoration of fundamental moral order. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below.